Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight, we're easing into a thought that doesn't arrive loudly or all at once. It doesn't announce itself with fire in the sky or sudden catastrophe. It arrives the way many ancient ideas do, slowly, almost quietly, carried forward through fragments of memory, preserved in clay, and repeated long after their original meaning had softened at the edges. This is a reflection on time, not as we experience it day by day, but as the ancient world understood it, as something that moves in patterns rather than straight lines, something that does not end so much as it turns. What we're exploring tonight is not a prediction, and it isn't a warning in the modern sense. It's a possibility drawn from how the earliest civilizations described the world around them, and the forces they believed governed it. The idea that the world does not move endlessly forward, accumulating progress until some final conclusion, but instead passes through phases of stability, disruption and renewal. And within that idea sits a quieter, more unsettling implication. The possibility that those described in the oldest texts as caretakers of order were not reacting to disasters as they happened, but operating with an awareness that such disruptions were inevitable, even expected. In modern discussions, the Anunnaki are often presented as dramatic figures, arriving suddenly, intervening forcefully, and departing just as abruptly. But the texts themselves describe something far less theatrical and far more procedural. They speak of systems, roles, and responsibilities, of maintenance rather than conquest, of balance rather than domination. When destruction appears in these records, it rarely arrives as a surprise. It unfolds as a consequence of imbalance, as something that emerges once thresholds are crossed and corrections become unavoidable. The question of whether the Anunnaki knew about a future reset is not about secret prophecies hidden in the margins of tablets or encoded warnings meant to be deciphered thousands of years later. It is about whether the structure of their world, as described by the people who wrote these texts, assumed that resets were part of how existence functioned. Not accidents, not failures, but features of a system designed to prevent total collapse. In the oldest Sumerian compositions, the world begins in a state that is already unstable. Waters press against boundaries. Forces exist before they are named. Order has to be established deliberately, and once established, it must be actively maintained. Nothing about this cosmology suggests permanence. Even the gods themselves are not eternal in the way later traditions would imagine divine beings to be. They are born. They assume roles. They act within constraints. And most importantly, they respond to conditions rather than overriding them entirely. This is why destruction in these texts often feels procedural rather than emotional. Floods are not punishments delivered in anger. They are corrections implemented when noise grows too loud, when populations expand beyond control, when systems strain under their own weight. The language used is practical. The reasoning is administrative. The world is not ending because it has failed morally. It is being reset because it has drifted too far from balance. When later readers encounter these stories, especially through modern lenses shaped by linear history and apocalyptic thinking, it's easy to assume that the people who recorded them believed the end had arrived. But that is not how the texts frame these events. After every great disruption, life continues. Cities are rebuilt, kingship resumes, agriculture returns. The memory of what came before remains, not as trauma, but as precedent. This is where the idea of foreknowledge quietly enters the conversation. Not foreknowledge in the sense of predicting specific dates or events, but an understanding of patterns. If cycles have occurred before, they will occur again. If order requires intervention once thresholds are crossed, then the timing of that intervention becomes part of governance. In this framework, knowing that a reset will come is not extraordinary. It is expected. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the texts, are not portrayed as improvising their responses to crisis. They convene, they deliberate, they weigh consequences, they argue, Decisions are made collectively, often reluctantly, and always with an awareness of long-term effects. Even when those decisions result in destruction, they are followed by measures designed to ensure continuity. Survivors are preserved. Knowledge is retained. Systems are re-established. This suggests a worldview in which endings are temporary states rather than absolute conclusions. The flood does not erase humanity. It reduces it. It reshapes it. It imposes limits where there were none before. Lifespans shorten. Populations are regulated. Distance between gods and humans increases, but existence itself continues forward, altered but intact. If we approach the idea of a reset from this perspective, the question becomes less dramatic and more structural. It is not whether the Anunnaki foresaw a specific catastrophe, but whether they operated within a system that assumed periodic collapse was inevitable. A system where stability accumulates pressure over time, and intervention becomes necessary once that pressure exceeds what the world can sustain on its own. In this light, silence in the text becomes as meaningful as action. There are long stretches where nothing dramatic is recorded, where the gods are present but inactive, where humanity is allowed to expand and build and grow without interference. These periods are not portrayed as mistakes. They are part of the cycle. Order must be tested before it can be corrected. The absence of warnings is also telling. Humans are rarely informed directly about what is coming. There are no broad announcements, no universal alarms. Knowledge is compartmentalized, passed quietly to individuals rather than populations, preserved in stories rather than instructions. This suggests that the role of humanity was not to prevent resets, but to endure them. In many ways, this is a far more unsettling idea than sudden apocalypse. It implies that destruction is not an aberration, but a recurring feature of existence, that civilizations are not meant to last indefinitely, that growth without constraint leads inevitably to correction, and that those tasked with maintaining order understood this well enough to act without hesitation when the time came. As we move forward, we'll look closely at how these cycles are described, not only in flood narratives, but in the structure of kingship, in the organization of the cosmos, and in the way memory itself is preserved across disruptions. We'll examine why the texts emphasize preparation rather than prevention, continuity rather than survival, and silence rather than warning. For now, we rest with the idea that the future, as imagined by the ancient world, was not a blank unknown. It was shaped by patterns that had already played out before. And within those patterns, the concept of a reset was not a failure of creation, but part of how creation sustained itself over time, quietly, methodically, and without finality. Long before the idea of history became a straight line moving from past to future, the world was understood very differently. Not as something progressing endlessly forward, improving with each generation, but as something that existed in a state of tension, held together temporarily and always subject to eventual change. In the oldest traditions preserved in clay and memory, the world was not designed to last forever in any fixed form. It was designed to function for a time, to hold order long enough for life to unfold, and then to give way when that order could no longer sustain itself. This idea appears so early and so consistently across ancient cultures that it can feel almost invisible to modern readers, who are accustomed to thinking in terms of permanence. Cities are built to endure. Institutions are designed to outlast their founders. Progress is measured by accumulation. But the people who first recorded their understanding of existence did not assume that stability was the default state of the world. They assumed the opposite. Stability was something imposed, maintained, and inevitably lost. In the earliest Mesopotamian texts, creation itself is not a moment of perfection, but a moment of arrangement. The world is assembled out of pre-existing forces that are already unstable. Water presses against land. Sky presses against earth. Boundaries have to be established deliberately, often violently. Order does not emerge naturally. It has to be enforced, and even then, it remains fragile. This framing alone tells us something crucial about how these cultures understood time. If order must be enforced, then it can also fail. And if it can fail, then the world as it exists now is not guaranteed to continue indefinitely. What is striking is how little emphasis these texts place on preservation for its own sake. The goal is not to make the world eternal, but to make it functional. Crops must grow. Rivers must flow within their banks. Cities must be supplied. Temples must be maintained. As long as these systems operate within acceptable limits, the world continues. When they do not, intervention becomes necessary. Not because something has gone wrong in a moral sense, but because imbalance has reached a point where correction is required. This way of thinking treats the world almost as a managed environment, rather than a sacred object that must be protected at all costs. The cosmos is not a finished masterpiece. It is an ongoing project, and like any project, it experiences wear, strain, and eventual breakdown if left unattended. The idea that the world does not last forever is not pessimistic in this framework. It is practical. Ancient kingship reflects this mindset clearly. Rulers are not presented as eternal figures or as guardians of an unchanging order. Their reigns are finite, sometimes deliberately exaggerated in length, to mark different eras, but always bounded. Kingship itself descends, withdraws, and reappears. Dynasties rise and fall. Cities are founded, abandoned, and rebuilt. None of this is treated as abnormal. It is simply how the world operates. Even the gods in these traditions are not exempt from change. They are born into a structure that already exists. They assume roles rather than defining reality from nothing. They can be replaced, diminished, or rendered distant. Divine authority shifts over time. Some gods fade from prominence. Others take on new responsibilities. The divine order itself evolves, which would make little sense in a worldview that expected permanence. The idea of a world that does not last forever is also embedded in how memory is handled. Knowledge is not preserved with the expectation that it will remain intact indefinitely. It is fragmented, encoded, ritualized. Stories are told and retold, changing slightly with each generation. Important information is often confined to priesthoods or ruling classes, rather than shared openly. This suggests an assumption that loss is inevitable. Records will be destroyed. Languages will change. Meanings will drift. What matters is not that everything survives, but that enough survives for the next cycle to begin. Flood narratives are the most obvious expression of this idea, but they are not the only ones. Long before water rises and cities disappear, the texts describe other forms of reset, periods of famine, withdrawal of divine presence. Silence in the records, sudden breaks in king lists. These moments are not framed as ends of the world, but as transitions between states. The world does not vanish, it becomes something else. This perspective changes how we interpret destruction. From a modern standpoint, collapse is failure. It is something to be avoided at all costs. But in ancient cosmology, collapse is sometimes the mechanism through which balance is restored. Excess is reduced. Complexity is simplified. Systems are stripped back to their foundations. From there, rebuilding becomes possible. This is why the language surrounding these events is often restrained. There is little emotional emphasis on loss, no lingering grief over destroyed cities, no outrage at divine decisions. The tone is observational. This happened. The world changed. Life continued. Such restraints suggest acceptance rather than resignation. The people recording these stories did not see themselves as living at the end of history. They saw themselves as living within a repeating pattern. The idea that the world does not last forever also shapes how humanity is positioned within it. Humans are not stewards of an eternal creation. They are participants in a temporary arrangement. Their role is functional rather than central. They farm, they build, they maintain, they serve both the land and the gods. When they exceed their role, intentionally or not, consequences follow. Not because they have violated a sacred trust, but because they have disrupted balance. This framing removes any sense of entitlement to permanence. Cities are not guaranteed to endure simply because they exist. Civilizations are not protected by virtue alone. Survival depends on alignment with forces larger than any single generation. When alignment fails, correction follows. What makes this idea particularly unsettling is its lack of drama. There is no final battle between good and evil, no ultimate triumph or defeat. There is only adjustment, reduction. Reorganization. The world continues, but not in the same form, and there is no indication that the final form will be the last. Over time, as later cultures inherited these stories, the emphasis shifted. Resets became moralized. Destruction was framed as punishment. Endings became final. But beneath these later interpretations, the older structure remains visible. A world designed to function, not to last forever. A cosmos built on cycles rather than conclusions. Understanding this ancient idea forces a re-evaluation of what stability means. Stability is not the absence of change. It is a temporary condition achieved through balance. When balance is lost, stability dissolves. This does not mean the world has failed. It means it is moving into its next phase. As we continue forward, this idea becomes essential for understanding the role attributed to the Anunnaki and others like them. If the world was never meant to last indefinitely in any single form, then those tasked with maintaining order were not guarding against an end. They were managing transitions, watching for thresholds, preparing for moments when intervention would be necessary not to save the world but to allow it to continue in a different state. And with that understanding in place, the concept of a reset stops feeling extraordinary. It becomes expected, almost routine. The world does not last forever, not because it is flawed, but because it was never designed to remain unchanged, and the knowledge of that impermanence sits quietly beneath every ancient account that follows. The earliest texts do not speak about endings because the people who wrote them were not trying to describe a final destination. They were trying to describe a process, a movement, a rhythm that governed how the world behaved over long spans of time. To them, an ending was not a meaningful concept on its own. What mattered was what came before, what followed after, and how the transition unfolded in between. When modern readers approach ancient material, there is often an expectation that stories should move toward resolution, that events should build, peak, and conclude. This expectation shapes how later religious traditions frame creation and destruction, often presenting them as singular, irreversible moments. But the oldest surviving records do not share this structure. They do not point toward a final collapse or a definitive conclusion. Instead, they return repeatedly to the same types of events, described in slightly different ways, unfolding across different eras, affecting different generations. This is not accidental. It reflects a fundamentally different understanding of time. In the world of the earlier scribes, time was not a straight path stretching from a distant beginning toward an unknown end. It was closer to a recurring current. Seasons returned. Floods came and receded. Crops were planted, harvested, and planted again. Even political power moved in cycles. Cities rose, fell, and were rebuilt on the same ground. Kingship descended, withdrew, and descended again. Nothing truly disappeared forever. It changed form. Because of this, the language of cycles appears everywhere once you know how to recognize it. Creation itself is not described as a single, unrepeatable event. The separation of heaven and earth establishes order, but that order is never described as permanent. The texts repeatedly emphasize maintenance. Canals must be cleared, temples must be repaired, offerings must continue. Without constant attention, disorder returns. This same logic applies to destruction. Floods are not treated as ultimate endings. They are interruptions, corrections that restore conditions closer to an earlier state before allowing the process to resume. After the waters recede, kingship returns. Agriculture resumes, cities are rebuilt. The world does not move forward into something entirely new. It resets to a familiar pattern, adjusted but recognizable. One of the clearest indicators of cyclical thinking is how the texts handle memory. Events are remembered not because they are unique, but because they exemplify a pattern. A flood is remembered because it demonstrates what happens when thresholds are crossed. A famine is recorded because it shows the consequences of imbalance. These memories serve as reference points, not warnings meant to prevent recurrence, but acknowledgements that recurrence is unavoidable. This is why there is so little emphasis on preventing catastrophe. The goal is not to stop cycles from repeating. The goal is to survive them, to carry enough forward that life can continue afterward. This orientation fundamentally changes how we should read these texts. When a disaster is described, it is not presented as something that should never have happened. It is presented as something that happens when certain conditions are met. The structure of divine decision-making reinforces this view. When the gods convene to deliberate, their concern is rarely whether destruction should occur at all. It is about scale, timing, and aftermath. How much should be reduced? What should be preserved? Who should survive? These are not questions asked by beings trying to prevent an ending. They are questions asked by administrators managing a cycle. Even disagreement among the gods fits within this framework. Conflicts are not about stopping destruction entirely, but about moderating it. One god argues for restraint, another argues for necessity. The outcome is compromise, not cancellation. The cycle proceeds, but altered. The absence of finality is also visible in how these texts end. There is rarely a definitive closing statement. Stories drift into silence, tablets break off, narratives stop without resolution. This is not always the result of physical damage, though that does play a role. It reflects a narrative style that does not prioritize closure. The story continues beyond what is written. The cycle extends into the future, assumed rather than explained. Later traditions would reinterpret these open-ended structures as incomplete or corrupted. They would supply conclusions. They would frame destruction as judgment and survival as reward. But these additions often obscure the older logic. In the earliest layers, morality is secondary to balance. Cause and effect are environmental rather than ethical. Noise disturbs rest. Overpopulation strains systems. Excess requires reduction. Cycles also explain why knowledge is preserved unevenly. Certain information is repeated obsessively. Genealogies, king lists, ritual instructions. Other information is allowed to fade. This selectivity suggests that what mattered was not preserving everything, but preserving enough to restart. The essentials, names, roles, processes, the rest could be rediscovered or reinvented. This approach makes sense in a world where destruction is expected. If you assume that records will be lost, you encode what matters into forms that can survive disruption. Oral tradition, ritual repetition, monumental architecture. These are resilient carriers of memory. They do not require continuous literacy or centralized institutions. They can persist through collapse. The cyclical view also reshapes the role of humanity. Humans are not cast as participants in a singular grand narrative moving toward an ultimate destiny. They are part of a repeating sequence. Each generation inherits the results of the previous one, benefits from accumulated knowledge, and contributes to conditions that will eventually require correction. This is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It is descriptive. In this framework, progress is not denied, but it is temporary. Advances are real, but they are not permanent. Cities can be more complex than those before them. Technologies can improve, but complexity itself creates fragility. The more elaborate a system becomes, the more points of failure it develops. Cycles are the mechanism through which this fragility is addressed. This is why resets often appear after periods of apparent success. Prosperity leads to density. Density leads to strain. Strain leads to disruption. Disruption clears space for renewal. The pattern repeats. The texts do not present this as tragedy. They present it as structure. Once this is understood, the lack of apocalyptic language becomes significant. There is no final reckoning, no irreversible destruction. Even the gods do not disappear forever. They withdraw, transform, or recede into background roles. Their presence diminishes, but their influence remains embedded in institutions, rituals, and memory. The idea of an ending would have made little sense in this worldview. An ending implies a termination without continuation. But nothing in the observed world behaved that way. Rivers dried up and returned. Cities were abandoned and resettled. Power shifted but did not vanish. Life adapted. So when the oldest texts speak of destruction, they do so with restraint. They are not announcing the end of everything. They are marking a transition point, a boundary between one phase and the next. What comes after may be diminished, simpler, quieter, but it's still part of the same ongoing movement. This perspective also explains why warnings are rare and often ambiguous. If cycles are inevitable, then warning everyone does not change the outcome. It may even worsen it by accelerating collapse through panic. Instead, knowledge is passed quietly, selectively, enough to ensure continuity, not enough to prevent disruption. The cyclical model does not eliminate uncertainty. Timing remains unclear. Thresholds are not always predictable, but the overall pattern is stable. Order arises, order degrades, order is restored in altered form. This is the rhythm the texts describe again and again. As we move deeper into this topic, this cyclical understanding becomes essential. Without it, the actions attributed to the Anunnaki and other divine figures appear arbitrary or cruel. With it, they appear procedural. Their decisions are not about ending the world. They are about managing transitions within a system that assumes repetition rather than finality. The oldest texts speak in cycles because cycles were how the world revealed itself to those who watched it closely over generations. Endings were not part of their lived experience. Change was. And in that continuous movement, the idea of a final end simply had no place. When the Sumerians spoke about order, they were not speaking about survival in the way modern societies tend to frame it. Survival, as we usually understand it, centers on persistence at any cost, staying alive, avoiding collapse, preventing extinction. But this way of thinking is largely absent from the oldest Mesopotamian texts. Instead, what appears again and again is a concern with order as a condition, not life as an absolute value. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything. For the Sumerians, existence was not justified simply because it continued. Existence had to function correctly. Fields had to yield crops at the right time. Rivers had to flood within expected limits. Temples had to receive offerings according to ritual schedules. Cities had to operate within defined boundaries. When these systems aligned, the world was said to be in order. When they did not, existence itself became unstable, regardless of whether people were still alive within it. In this worldview, survival without order was not a success. It was a problem. The Sumerian concept, most often translated as order, does not imply peace or safety. It implies arrangement, placement, proper distribution of roles and forces. The cosmos was seen as a structured environment where every element had a function. Gods had domains, humans had duties, natural forces had limits. Order existed when each of these remained within its assigned scope. When we read Sumerian creation texts carefully, we see that the first act of creation is not the creation of life, but the establishment of boundaries. Heaven is separated from earth. Waters are divided. Domains are assigned. Only after this does life emerge in an organised form. Life, in this sense, is a secondary outcome. Structure comes first. This is why destruction appears so differently in Sumerian thought. A flood that wipes out cities is not described primarily as the loss of life. It is described as the collapse of arrangement. Canals break, fields are submerged, temples are abandoned, noise overwhelms the gods. The problem is not that humans die. The problem is that the system stops functioning. When order fails, survival becomes irrelevant. This perspective explains why the gods in Sumerian texts do not react emotionally to human suffering in the way later traditions expect divine beings to behave. They are not indifferent, but their priorities are different. Their concern is systemic stability. When humanity grows too numerous, too loud, too disruptive, the issue is not cruelty or injustice, it is imbalance. Noise, in particular, appears repeatedly as a sign of disorder. This is often misunderstood as trivial or symbolic, but within the Sumerian worldview, noise represents density, congestion, uncontrolled expansion. A quiet world is one where systems operate smoothly. A loud world is one where boundaries have been exceeded. In this context, the decision to reduce humanity through catastrophe is not framed as annihilation, but as correction. It is not about wiping out life, it is about restoring conditions under which life can be managed again. This also clarifies why preservation efforts in these stories are selective. Not everyone is saved, not every city survives. Instead, representatives are preserved. A king, a family, seeds, animals, knowledge. Enough to restart the system, not enough to preserve the previous one intact. Survival of everything would defeat the purpose. Order, as the Sumerians understood it, required limitation. Excess was dangerous. Growth without constraint led inevitably to collapse. This applied not only to humans, but to gods as well. Divine authority itself had to be distributed carefully. No single god governed everything. Power was divided, delegated, checked through councils and assemblies. Even the highest gods could not act unilaterally without consequence. This distributed model of authority mirrors the way order was maintained in the human world. Kings ruled cities, not the entire earth. Priests managed rituals. Farmers managed fields. Scribes managed records. Each role had boundaries. Overreach was destabilizing. When these boundaries were violated, disorder followed. Sometimes this disorder was localized. A famine, a failed harvest, a city's decline. Other times it was systemic, a flood, a mass reduction, a reset. What is striking is that nowhere in these texts do we find the idea that survival itself is sacred. Humanity exists to serve a function within the larger system. Humans are created to relieve the gods of labour. They maintain canals. They build temples. They provide offerings. Their continued existence is valuable insofar as it supports order. This does not mean human life is meaningless. It means meaning is conditional. Later traditions would invert this logic, placing human survival at the centre of cosmic concern. But in the Sumerian worldview, humans are participants, not beneficiaries. They are necessary components, but not the ultimate purpose. This is why moral language is so sparse in the earliest layers of these texts. Disasters are not framed as punishments for wrongdoing in the ethical sense. They are responses to conditions. The world becomes too crowded. Resources are strained. Divine rest is disturbed. Action follows. The gods themselves are bound by this logic. They cannot simply destroy everything and walk away. Doing so would undo the very structure that supports their own existence. Temples would be gone. Offerings would cease. Order would collapse entirely. This is why even the most severe interventions are followed by rebuilding. The goal is never extinction. The goal is restoration of function. Understanding this helps explain why the Sumerians were not obsessed with preventing catastrophe. Prevention would require freezing the system in place, stopping growth, halting change. That would violate the nature of the world as they understood it. Change was inevitable. The task was not to stop it, but to manage its consequences. This also sheds light on why knowledge was preserved the way it was. Sumerian texts do not attempt to save everything. They save what is necessary for order to be re-established. Ritual instructions, genealogies, calendrical systems, agricultural knowledge. These are the tools required to rebuild structure after disruption. Stories themselves function as part of this system. They are not entertainment. They are memory containers. They encode how the world works, how order fails, and how it is restored. They do not urge listeners to cling to the present. They prepare them to accept change. This acceptance is perhaps the most difficult aspect for modern readers to grasp. We tend to see collapse as failure. The Sumerians saw collapse as a phase, not desirable, but expected, not avoidable, but manageable. From this perspective, survival without order would be worse than death. A world where systems no longer function, where boundaries are erased, where everything exists in chaotic abundance or scarcity, would be uninhabitable in a meaningful sense. Life would continue, but existence would be degraded beyond recognition. Order, then, is what makes life worth sustaining. As we move deeper into the question of foreknowledge and resets, this distinction becomes critical. If the Anunnaki and other gods operated within a framework that prioritized order over survival, then their actions must be interpreted differently. They were not guardians of life at any cost. They were custodians of balance. This does not make them benevolent or malevolent in the human sense. It makes them functional. Their decisions are driven by thresholds, not compassion, by system limits, not individual suffering. Once this is understood, the absence of warnings, the selectivity of survival, and the inevitability of resets no longer appear cruel or mysterious. They appear consistent. The Sumerians did not ask whether the world would survive forever. That question would have made little sense to them. They asked whether the world was in order now, and if not, what would be required to restore it. And within that logic, the continuation of life was a consequence of order, not its justification. When the tablets describe destruction, they are careful with their language. They do not collapse multiple kinds of change into a single idea. What modern readers often label simply as collapse is treated in the texts as something more specific, more conditional. There is a difference between a system breaking apart unintentionally and a system being deliberately reduced so that it can function again. This distinction sits quietly beneath many of the most famous Sumerian narratives, and once it is noticed, the logic of those stories begins to shift. Collapse, as we usually imagine it, is uncontrolled failure. It is the unravelling of structure without guidance, a loss of coherence where systems fall apart faster than they can be repaired. In a collapse, there is no intention beyond immediate survival, and often not even that. Everything degrades at once. Authority dissolves, knowledge fragments, continuity is broken. But this is not what the tablets describe when they recount floods, divine withdrawals, or population reductions. What they describe aligns much more closely with a reset. A reset is not chaos. It is a recalibration. It is not the end of a system, but a return to an earlier, simpler state from which order can be rebuilt. The difference matters because it tells us how the ancient writers understood the forces acting on their world. In the flood narratives, for example, the world does not dissolve into randomness. The waters rise, but they do so within a recognizable framework. Cities are submerged, but the land remains. Humanity is reduced, but not eliminated. Animals are preserved. Knowledge survives. The very act of preservation is described in detail, which would make little sense if the event were understood as an uncontrolled collapse. A collapse would not require planning. A reset does. The tablets consistently emphasize preparation, even when that preparation is limited to a single individual or family. Instructions are given. Measurements are specified. Timelines are implied. These are not the hallmarks of a world spiralling out of control. They are the hallmarks of intervention. Another key difference appears in what happens afterward. After a collapse, recovery is uncertain and often impossible. Systems must be reinvented from scratch if they can be rebuilt at all. After a reset, however, restoration follows a familiar pattern. Kingship returns, cities are refounded, temples are rebuilt on known sites, agricultural cycles resume using the same methods as before. This continuity suggests that the reset was not meant to erase memory. It was meant to prune excess. The king lists reinforce this interpretation. When reigns are interrupted, they are not erased. They are segmented. Pre-flood and post-flood eras are distinguished, but they are connected. Kingship does not end. It transfers. The language used implies succession rather than termination. Authority continues, but under new constraints. If the Sumerians believed the flood represented total collapse, this continuity would be impossible. There would be no reason to preserve genealogies that extend across the divide, no reason to maintain city names, no reason to re-establish institutions in recognizable form. A reset, by contrast, depends on memory. This also explains why the texts often treat the moment of destruction itself with relative brevity. The flood happens, the waters rise, the cities disappear. But the focus quickly shifts to what follows: the re-emergence of land, the offering of sacrifices, the reorganization of life. The destruction is a mechanism, not the point of the story. Collapse would be the story. Reset is only the transition. The language surrounding divine deliberation further supports this distinction. When the gods convene, they do not debate whether existence should continue. They debate scale, timing, intensity. One god argues that humanity has grown too numerous. Another argues that complete destruction would be excessive. The outcome is not annihilation. It is reduction. Reduction is a reset logic, not a collapse logic. This same pattern appears outside of flood narratives. Periods of famine are described not as accidental disasters, but as withdrawals of abundance. The land withholds its yield. The gods close access to resources. This forces migration, depopulation, and simplification. When balance is restored, abundance returns. The cycle resumes. In these cases, survival is possible precisely because the system has not collapsed entirely. The reset preserves the underlying structure while stripping away unsustainable complexity. Complexity is a recurring concern in the tablets, even if it is not named explicitly. As cities grow, administrative systems multiply. Labour becomes specialised. Trade networks expand. With this complexity comes fragility. A single disruption can cascade through interconnected systems. The Sumerians may not have described this in abstract terms, but they observed its effects. Resets reduce complexity. After a reset, societies are smaller. Authority is more centralised. Roles are clearer. The margin for imbalance is wider. This makes the system more stable, at least temporarily. Over time, complexity builds again. Prosperity returns. Density increases. The cycle repeats. This framing also clarifies why the gods are not portrayed as scrambling to save everything. Saving everything would preserve the very complexity that led to imbalance. The goal is not preservation. The goal is correction. Collapse destroys indiscriminately. Reset is selective. The selectivity is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of these narratives for modern readers. Why is one person warned and not others? Why are animals preserved but cities lost? Why is knowledge carried forward in fragments rather than in full? But within a reset framework, these choices are consistent. The intention is not fairness. It is continuity. Continuity requires minimal viable systems, seeds rather than fields, plans rather than buildings, roles rather than populations. What is preserved is what is necessary to restart order, not what is emotionally valued. The tablets also suggest that resets are bounded events. They have beginnings and ends. The flood lasts a defined period. The waters recede. The world stabilizes. There is no suggestion that destruction will continue indefinitely. This boundedness is another marker of a reset rather than a collapse. Collapse has no built-in endpoint. Reset does. Even divine power appears constrained during these events. Once a decision is made, it must play out. Individual gods cannot simply reverse it on a whim. They can mitigate. They can adapt. But the process itself unfolds according to established rules. This procedural character reinforces the idea that resets are part of the system, not exceptions to it. It is also worth noting what the tablets do not describe. They do not describe attempts to rebuild the old world exactly as it was. There is no effort to restore pre-flood lifespans, no attempt to recreate the same population density. New limits are imposed deliberately. Mortality becomes fixed. Boundaries between gods and humans harden. A reset does not aim to return to a previous peak. It aims to establish a new baseline. This distinction is critical for understanding later developments. When subsequent cultures reinterpret these stories, they often collapse the distinction between collapse and reset. Destruction becomes punishment. Survival becomes reward. Endings become final. But in the oldest layers, the logic is different. Destruction is not moral. It is structural. Survival is not triumph. It is function. Understanding this helps explain why the texts are so restrained in their emotional tone. There is little lamentation, little outrage, little sense of injustice. The world changes because it must. The system adjusts because it cannot continue as it was. The difference between collapse and reset also sheds light on silence. After major disruptions, there are gaps in the record. These are not presented as mysteries to be solved. They are expected. Knowledge is lost. Writing pauses. Oral tradition carries what it can. When records resume, they do not attempt to fill in every missing detail. They move forward. This acceptance of loss is incompatible with a collapse worldview, which would treat loss as failure. In a reset worldview, loss is part of the mechanism. As we continue forward, this distinction becomes increasingly important. If the Anunnaki and other figures in the texts are understood as participants in resets, rather than witnesses to collapses, their actions take on a different character. They are not responding to disasters after the fact. They are implementing transitions within a system that anticipates breakdown. A collapse catches its participants by surprise. A reset does not. And once that difference is recognized, the question shifts. It is no longer about whether ancient peoples feared the end of the world. It becomes about how they understood the necessity of reducing it, reshaping it, and allowing it to begin again under conditions that could be sustained for another cycle. When floods appear in the tablets, they are not framed as incomprehensible disasters that shattered an otherwise stable world. They are framed as remembered events, recalled with structure, repetition, and restraint. The language used to describe them does not linger on terror or chaos. Instead, it catalogues sequence, cause, and aftermath. This alone tells us something important. The flood was not remembered because it was shocking. It was remembered because it fit into an existing understanding of how the world behaves when balance is lost. In a modern context, catastrophe implies randomness and finality. Something goes wrong. Systems fail unexpectedly. Life is altered irreversibly. But this is not how floods function in the Sumerian imagination. They are not random. They are not inexplicable. And they are never final. The Sumerians lived with water as a constant presence. Their cities were built on floodplains. Their agriculture depended entirely on rivers that could nourish or destroy depending on timing and volume. Seasonal flooding was normal. Beneficial floods were welcomed. Dangerous floods were feared, but not misunderstood. Water was both creator and destroyer, and this dual role shaped how floods were interpreted at every level, from daily life to cosmic myth. Because of this lived experience, The flood in the tablets is not portrayed as an alien interruption of reality. It is an extension of something already familiar, scaled up to a cosmic level. The same force that irrigates fields, when uncontained, dissolves cities. The same waters that bring life, when boundaries fail, erase it. This continuity matters. It means the flood is not outside the system. It is what happens when the system exceeds its limits. This is why floods are remembered rather than mourned. Memory in this context is functional. The flood is recalled to explain why the world is the way it is now, why lifespans are shorter, why humans are fewer, why gods are more distant, why certain boundaries exist that did not exist before. The flood is not an open wound, it is a marker. In the tablets, the flood almost always appears as a dividing line rather than an ending. Before the flood, conditions were different. After the flood, new rules apply. The texts do not dwell on what was lost. They focus on what changed. This is a crucial distinction. If the flood were remembered as catastrophe, we would expect grief, protest, and moral outrage to dominate the narratives. We would expect questions about justice. We would expect attempts to explain why such suffering was allowed. But these elements are largely absent. Instead, we find explanation without apology. The gods decided. The waters came. Life continued under new constraints. The absence of emotional emphasis does not indicate indifference. It indicates acceptance. This acceptance is reinforced by repetition. Flood stories appear across centuries in multiple versions, retold with variations but preserving the same structural elements. Divine deliberation, warning given selectively, preservation of life in minimal form, destruction bounded by time, restoration afterward. This repetition is not accidental. It is how memory is stabilized. The flood becomes a reference event, a shared point of orientation for understanding history. It explains discontinuity without denying continuity. There was a break, but not an erasure. This is why the flood is never treated as something to be prevented in future narratives. There is no emphasis on building permanent defences. No suggestion that humanity should find a way to stop it from happening again. Instead, there is an emphasis on preparedness, obedience, and continuity. The lesson is not how to avoid the flood. The lesson is how to endure it. This perspective makes sense in a world where floods, both literal and metaphorical, are inevitable. The rivers will overflow again. Cities will be threatened again. Systems will strain again. The flood story teaches how to respond, not how to escape. Another important aspect of flood memory is scale. The tablets do not describe the entire planet being submerged. They describe a world as it was known to the Sumerians being overwhelmed. Cities disappear, fields vanish, human activity ceases, but the cosmos itself remains intact. Heaven does not fall, the gods do not die, the earth endures. This localized framing reinforces the idea that the flood is not cosmic annihilation. It is regional reset elevated to mythic significance. The world of humans is wiped clean. The larger structure persists. This distinction is often lost in later retellings, where the flood becomes universal and total. But in the earliest layers, the flood is devastating without being absolute. This allows memory to function without despair. Memory also shapes how responsibility is distributed. The flood is not blamed on human sin in a moral sense. It is blamed on excess, noise, overcrowding, disruption of divine rest. These are not ethical failings, they are systemic conditions. By framing the flood this way, the texts avoid assigning guilt to individuals. Humanity as a whole becomes part of a system that exceeded its limits. Correction follows. No one is singled out for punishment except those selected for preservation, and even that selection is not framed as reward. It is framed as necessity. The preserved individual does not survive because of moral superiority. They survive because they serve a function. They carry knowledge. They restart lineage. They maintain continuity. This functional logic is essential to understanding flood memory. The survivor is not a hero in the modern sense. They are a vessel. After the flood, the first act is not celebration or relief. It is sacrifice. Offerings are made immediately. This is not gratitude for survival alone. It is re-establishment of order. Communication between humans and gods resumes. Roles are reaffirmed. The system begins again. If the flood were remembered as catastrophe, survival would be the climax of the story. But survival is only the transition. The real focus is restoration. Another sign that floods function as memory rather than catastrophe is how casually they are referenced in later texts. The flood is mentioned as a known event, a shared background. It does not require retelling every time. Its details are assumed. This casualness indicates familiarity rather than trauma. Trauma demands repetition. Memory demands reference. The flood also serves as an explanation for absence. Why are there gaps in the king lists? Why do certain cities disappear from the record? Why does writing appear to restart? The flood answers these questions without requiring speculation. It is a known reset point. This explanatory role makes the flood indispensable to the Sumerian understanding of history. Without it, discontinuity would be alarming. With it, discontinuity is expected. The flood also redefines humanity's relationship with time. Before the flood, time behaves differently. Lifespans are immense. Reigns stretch across impossible spans. After the flood, time contracts. Life becomes finite. History becomes measurable. The flood is the boundary between mythic time and human time. This temporal shift is not framed as loss. It is framed as adjustment. The world becomes more constrained but also more stable. Excess is removed. Limits are imposed. This again reinforces the idea that the flood is not catastrophe. It is calibration. When viewed this way, the flood becomes a tool of memory rather than a symbol of destruction. It teaches that the world has changed before and will change again. It teaches that continuity depends on adaptability. It teaches that order can be restored after even the most severe disruption. This teaching would have been especially important for a society living in an environment where floods were a constant threat. Remembering the flood as manageable, bounded and survivable would have been psychologically stabilizing. It transforms fear into expectation. The flood also encodes a warning without alarm. It does not say this will never happen again. It says this has happened before, and because it has happened before, it can be understood. As we move forward, this understanding becomes crucial. If floods are remembered not as singular catastrophes, but as recurring resets, then the possibility of future resets is implied rather than stated. The memory does not point backward alone. It establishes a pattern, and within that pattern, knowledge is preserved not to prevent the next flood, but to ensure that something remains afterward. Seeds, stories, systems. The flood, then, is not the end of the world in the Sumerian imagination. It is one of the ways the world renews itself, a moment when excess is stripped away and the foundations are exposed again. By remembering the flood this way, the Sumerians were not denying suffering. They were contextualizing it, placing it within a cycle that allowed life to continue without the illusion of permanence. And that framing, quiet and restrained, sits beneath every later reference to water, destruction and renewal that follows in the tablets, waiting to be recognized not as fear, but as memory doing its work. In the tablets, destruction rarely arrives as a shock to the divine realm. There is no sense of panic, no sudden scrambling to respond to an unforeseen crisis. Instead, what we see again and again is deliberation that takes place before the event, not after it. Councils are convened, complaints are voiced, thresholds are acknowledged, decisions are made. When destruction finally occurs, it unfolds as something already anticipated. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the Sumerian worldview and one of the most easily misunderstood. In later traditions, gods are often portrayed as reacting emotionally to events. They are angered by disobedience, disappointed by failure, or moved by compassion. Destruction follows as a response to an unexpected breach of divine expectations. But in the earliest Mesopotamian texts, the gods are not caught off guard. They are not surprised because the conditions that lead to destruction are observable, measurable, and familiar. Noise increases, populations grow, cities expand, labour intensifies, temples multiply, offerings increase. On the surface, these appear to be signs of success, but beneath them, strain accumulates. The gods notice this long before catastrophe occurs. The complaints that precede destruction are especially telling. They are not framed as moral indictments. Humans are not accused of wickedness or rebellion. Instead, the language is practical and almost mundane. The world has become too crowded. The noise has grown too loud. Rest is disturbed. Systems are overloaded. These are not surprises. They are outcomes. The gods observe the same patterns repeating over long spans of time. They remember previous cycles. They recognize when conditions begin to resemble those that preceded earlier resets. This memory informs their decisions. They are not improvising. They are responding to indicators. This is why divine deliberation is such a prominent feature of these narratives. Before destruction, there is discussion. Different gods argue for different responses. One points out the burden of human activity. Another warns against total annihilation. The debate is not about whether destruction is possible. It is about whether it is necessary now. The presence of disagreement does not indicate uncertainty about outcomes. It indicates differing priorities within a shared understanding of the system. All parties recognise that unchecked growth leads to instability. The question is how to correct it without causing irreparable damage. This shared understanding eliminates surprise. Even when destruction takes a dramatic form, such as a flood, the gods are not reacting in real time. They are implementing a decision that has already been made. The flood itself is procedural. Winds gather, waters rise, boundaries fail. The sequence unfolds according to established patterns. There is no indication that the gods are shocked by the scale of what happens. They do not express regret over unforeseen consequences. Instead, they respond to the aftermath by adjusting conditions to prevent immediate repetition. Lifespans are shortened, fertility is regulated, distance between gods and humans increases. These adjustments suggest that the gods anticipated the effects of destruction and planned for what would follow. They are not surprised by what the reset produces, they expected it. This expectation is rooted in how the gods themselves are positioned within the cosmos. They are not outside the system, they are part of it. They are subject to its constraints. They require order to maintain their own existence. Temples must function, offerings must continue, labour must be performed. Because of this, they pay attention to systemic stress. They feel its effects directly. When humans multiply excessively, it is not an abstract concern. It disrupts divine rest. It increases administrative burden. It destabilizes the balance that sustains both realms. Surprise would imply detachment. The gods are anything but detached. Another reason the gods are never surprised by destruction is that they do not assume permanence. From the moment order is established, its eventual breakdown is implicit. Boundaries exist because they are needed. What is needed can also fail. This logic applies universally. Heaven and earth were once joined. They had to be separated. That separation required force. The possibility of rejoining, of collapse back into undifferentiated chaos, remains ever present. The gods are tasked with preventing that collapse, but prevention does not mean elimination of risk. It means management. Management assumes fluctuation. The gods understand that order is maintained temporarily. It is not fixed. It must be adjusted as conditions change. Destruction is one of the tools available for adjustment. Not the first tool, but not an unthinkable one either. This understanding also explains why warnings are selective. If destruction were a surprise, broad warning would be necessary. Everyone would need to be alerted so they could respond. But because destruction is expected within the system, warning serves a different purpose. It is not meant to save everyone, it is meant to preserve continuity. Those who are warned are not chosen randomly. They are chosen because they can carry something forward. Knowledge, lineage, ritual, seeds. The warning is not about avoiding destruction. It is about ensuring that something remains afterward. The gods do not warn humanity collectively because collective survival would undermine the corrective function of the reset. Excess would persist. The system would remain unstable. The goal is not to prevent loss. It is to control it. This again removes any element of surprise. The gods are not scrambling to salvage what they can. They are executing a plan. Even emotional responses attributed to the gods fit within this framework. Anger appears, but it is not sudden rage. It is irritation that builds over time, restlessness, disturbance, fatigue. These are signs of prolonged imbalance, not momentary offence. When the decision to destroy is finally made, it is presented as inevitable rather than impulsive. The language often implies reluctance, but not shock. The gods know what this kind of intervention entails. They have done it before. This repetition is key. The gods are never surprised by destruction because destruction has precedent. The tablets are full of references to earlier disruptions. Even creation itself is described as an act of violent separation. Destruction and creation are not opposites. They are related processes. To create order, something must be broken apart. To restore order, something must be reduced. This continuity between creation and destruction eliminates surprise. The same forces are at work. The same logic applies. Another important factor is the way time is perceived in these texts. Divine time does not move at the same pace as human time. The gods observe long arcs. Generations blur together. Patterns become visible. What feels sudden to humans appears gradual to gods. From a human perspective, a flood arrives abruptly. From a divine perspective, it is the culmination of centuries of build-up. The gods have watched population rise, cities spread, noise increase. The flood is not the beginning of change. It is the end point of a long process. This difference in temporal perspective is crucial. Surprise depends on scale and speed. What is sudden on one scale is predictable on another. The gods occupy the larger scale. This also explains why the gods do not appear remorseful in the way modern readers might expect. Remorse implies unintended harm. But within this framework, harm is understood as necessary. The alternative is greater instability, which would threaten the entire system. The gods are not indifferent to suffering, but they are constrained by function. Their responsibility is to the system as a whole, not to individual lives. This responsibility forces them to act when conditions demand it, regardless of emotional cost. Because of this, destruction is never framed as failure. It is framed as consequence. The gods are also not surprised by what follows destruction. They anticipate rebuilding. They anticipate reduced populations. They anticipate changes in human behaviour. This anticipation shapes post-reset adjustments. Limits are imposed deliberately. Mortality becomes fixed. Human-divine interaction becomes more distant. These changes are not reactions to unexpected outcomes. They are preventative measures designed to slow the accumulation of imbalance in the next cycle. The gods learn, but they do not learn through surprise. They learn through repetition. Each cycle informs the next. Adjustments are made incrementally. This learning process is subtle, but consistent. It shows a system refining itself over time, not progressing toward perfection, but toward sustainability. The absence of surprise also suggests that the gods do not believe in absolute control. They cannot simply freeze the world in a stable state. Growth will occur, complexity will increase, limits will be tested. Destruction is one of the few ways to reset conditions without dismantling the system entirely. From this perspective, surprise would indicate negligence. The gods would have failed to observe their own creation. The texts do not support this view. Instead, they present gods who are deeply attentive, perhaps even burdened by attention. They are always watching, always measuring, always aware of how close the system is to its limits. As we continue forward, this understanding becomes increasingly important. If the gods were never surprised by destruction, then their actions surrounding resets must be interpreted as deliberate rather than reactive. They are not responding to sudden crises. They are acting at moments they recognize as necessary. This shifts the focus away from dramatic catastrophe and toward long-term management. The question is no longer why the gods allowed destruction. It becomes why they waited as long as they did. And within that waiting, within that careful observation of rising imbalance, the idea of foreknowledge begins to take shape. Not foreknowledge of specific events, but of inevitable outcomes. The gods do not know the future because it is written. They know it because the system behaves predictably when pushed beyond its limits. Destruction, in this light, is not an interruption of order. It is one of the ways order asserts itself, and that is why in the tablets the gods are never surprised when it arrives. When the Anunnaki appear in the tablets, they do not arrive as conquerors, inventors, or supreme rulers imposing their will through force. Their presence is quieter and more procedural. They are not described as creating the world, nor as reshaping it through raw power. Instead, they emerge within a system that already exists, taking on defined responsibilities that revolve around regulation rather than domination. This is why their role is best understood not as holders of ultimate power, but as administrators of timing. Power, in the Sumerian worldview, is diffuse. No single group or deity controls everything. Authority is layered, delegated, and constrained. Even the highest gods operate within assemblies and councils. Decisions are debated, outcomes are negotiated. Within this structure, the Anunnaki occupy a specific function that becomes visible only when we stop expecting them to behave like later conceptions of gods. They are associated not with action, but with determination, not with creation, but with decree, not with immediate intervention, but with thresholds. The tablets consistently place the Anunnaki at moments where outcomes are formalized rather than initiated. They are present when fates are fixed, when destinies are assigned, when boundaries are enforced. They do not cause events to unfold. They preside over the moment when an unfolding process is acknowledged as irreversible. In this sense, they do not decide what happens. They decide when it happens. This distinction is subtle but essential. In narratives involving the underworld, the Anunnaki are depicted as judges. They sit, they observe, they pronounce, they do not pursue souls, they do not inflict punishment through violence. Their authority lies in recognition. Once they speak, a condition becomes binding. Before they speak, possibility remains open. This function aligns closely with timing rather than power. Power would imply the ability to alter outcomes at will. Timing implies responsibility for declaring when an outcome has matured into necessity. The Anunnaki are not portrayed as passionate or impulsive. They do not argue loudly, they do not scheme. They are restrained figures, often silent until their presence is required. This restraint has led many readers to underestimate their importance, assuming that quieter gods must be lesser gods. But within administrative systems, silence often signals authority rather than weakness. They are not needed until a decision must be finalized, when cycles approach their limits, when imbalance has accumulated beyond correction through minor adjustments. The Anunnaki become relevant. They mark the moment when transition must occur. This is why they appear in association with death, endings, and boundaries. Death itself, in this framework, is not annihilation. It is transition, a movement from one state to another. The Anunnaki oversee that movement. This oversight does not require power in the modern sense. It requires legitimacy. Their authority derives from consensus within the divine order, not from force. They do not act alone. They act as a collective. Their judgments are binding because they reflect the structure of the system rather than individual preference. This collective aspect is significant. The Anunnaki are rarely individualized in the texts. They are named as a group more often than as distinct personalities. This suggests that their function is institutional rather than personal. They are less like rulers and more like an office. Offices persist even when individuals change. This helps explain why the Anunnaki are associated with continuity across cycles. They do not belong to a single era. They persist through transitions because their role is needed precisely when eras change. They are not diminished by resets. They become more relevant. The idea that they are administrators of timing rather than power also clarifies why they are linked to the underworld. The underworld is not simply a place of punishment. It is a repository, a holding space, a domain where things that are no longer active in the surface world are stored rather than destroyed. Timing governs storage. What is placed in the underworld is not erased. It is removed from circulation. Souls wait. Knowledge sleeps. Forces are contained. The Anunnaki preside over this containment, ensuring that what must be paused is paused, and what must be released remains withheld until conditions change. This role requires patience rather than strength. In stories where the Anunnaki appear to act harshly, such as judgments passed on deities or mortals, the harshness comes not from cruelty but from inflexibility. Once timing has been declared, reversal is difficult. The system depends on consistency. If judgments could be undone casually, order would erode. This rigidity is often mistaken for malevolence. But within administrative systems, rigidity is what ensures predictability. Predictability allows cycles to function. The Anunnaki do not create the conditions that lead to resets. They do not increase human population. They do not expand cities. They do not encourage excess. They observe. When excess reaches a point where correction is unavoidable, they formalize the transition. In this sense, they are not agents of destruction. They are witnesses to inevitability. This interpretation also explains why the Anunnaki are not portrayed as warning humanity. Warning implies prevention. Prevention would undermine their role. Their function is not to stop cycles from completing. It is to ensure that cycles complete cleanly, without tearing the entire system apart. This again places them closer to timing than power. Power could delay or accelerate events arbitrarily. Timing acknowledges when delay is no longer possible. The Anunnaki appear late in divine genealogies because timing becomes relevant only after systems have developed complexity. In primordial chaos, there is nothing to administer. Only after order exists, after populations grow, after institutions form, does timing become a governing concern. This may be why the Anunnaki are absent from the earliest moments of creation. They are not needed when everything is potential. They are needed when potential solidifies into structure, and structure begins to strain. Their late emergence does not make them secondary. It makes them specialized. Specialization is a hallmark of advanced systems. As civilizations grew more complex, the need to regulate transitions increased. Sudden collapse would be catastrophic. Managed reduction allows continuity. The Anunnaki embody this management at the cosmic level. Their association with fate further reinforces this interpretation. Fate, in Sumerian thought, is not blind destiny. It is allocation, assignment, determination of duration. The Anunnaki do not invent fate. They distribute it. Distribution is an administrative act. When lifespans are shortened after a flood, this is not random punishment. It is an adjustment to timing. Shorter lives slow population growth. They reduce density. They widen the margin before imbalance returns. This is timing used as regulation. The Anunnaki's involvement in these adjustments suggests that they operate across cycles, learning from previous outcomes. They do not change the fundamental structure of existence, but they refine its parameters. This refinement is incremental. It is not dramatic. Again, this is not how power behaves. Power seeks visibility. Administration seeks stability. The Anunnaki are rarely worshipped directly in the way other gods are. They do not have many temples. They do not receive abundant offerings. This absence is telling. They are not meant to be appealed to. Their decisions are not negotiable through devotion. Appeal would imply influence. Their role does not allow for influence. They are not arbiters of favour. They are arbiters of timing. This also explains why they appear fearsome despite their quietness. Fear arises not from violence but from finality. When the Anunnaki act, a phase ends. Doors close. Possibilities narrow. This inevitability inspires dread more effectively than force ever could. Once timing is declared, adaptation becomes the only option. In this light, the Anunnaki can be understood as guardians of thresholds. They stand at the points where one state transitions into another. They do not push. They do not pull. They allow passage only when the system has reached that point on its own. This interpretation strips away much of the modern mythology that surrounds them. They are not extraterrestrial overlords. They are not creators of humanity. They are not engineers of civilization. They are stewards of transition. Stewardship is often invisible until it fails. The Anunnaki do not fail because they do not resist change. They facilitate it. As we move forward, this understanding becomes increasingly important. If the Anunnaki are administrators of timing rather than power, then their relationship to resets shifts dramatically. They are not reacting to disaster. They are marking the moment when continuation requires reduction. This also reframes the idea of foreknowledge. The Anunnaki do not know the future because it is hidden from others. They know it because they recognize when patterns have matured. They do not predict resets. They confirm them. Their knowledge is structural, not prophetic. This distinction will matter as we explore why certain knowledge was preserved, why silence precedes intervention, and why humanity is rarely warned. Timing cannot be negotiated. It can only be observed and acknowledged. The Anunnaki exist at that moment of acknowledgement. They are not powerful because they control outcomes. They are powerful because they determine when outcomes become unavoidable. And within a world governed by cycles rather than endings, that authority quietly shapes everything that follows. In the tablets, knowledge is never treated as something meant to circulate freely. It is not presented as a gift offered openly to all of humanity, nor as a tool for preventing what is to come. Instead, knowledge appears as something carefully held back, distributed unevenly, and preserved across time rather than shared across populations. This distinction is deliberate, and it tells us a great deal about how the Sumerians understood both stability and disruption. From a modern perspective, knowledge is often framed as protection. If people know what is coming, they can prepare, they can adapt, they can avoid catastrophe. But this logic does not appear in the earliest Mesopotamian texts. Knowledge does not function as a warning system. It functions as continuity insurance. The gods do not reveal everything they know. They do not explain cycles in full. They do not outline future disruptions in clear terms. Instead, they allow fragments to persist. Hints, patterns, ritual instructions, genealogies, technical knowledge embedded in practice rather than explanation. What survives is not insight, but capability. This difference matters. When knowledge is shared broadly, it changes behaviour immediately. It alters collective action. It can accelerate growth, intensify complexity, and increase strain on systems already near their limits. Shared knowledge amplifies. Preserved knowledge stabilizes. The tablets consistently favour preservation. One of the clearest examples of this appears in creation narratives themselves. Humanity is created to perform labour. to maintain canals, to build, to farm. Humans are not created with full understanding of the divine system they serve. They are not taught how decisions are made in the divine assembly. They are not informed of thresholds, cycles, or reset conditions. They know how to act, not why the system behaves as it does. This is not omission by accident. It is structural. The gods do not want humanity optimizing the system beyond its sustainable limits. Full knowledge would enable that. Instead, humans are given just enough to function within boundaries. Excess understanding would undermine order. This pattern repeats everywhere. Priests possess ritual knowledge that common people do not. Scribes possess literacy that most of the population lacks. Kings possess genealogical legitimacy that ordinary humans cannot access. Knowledge is layered, not democratized. Each layer corresponds to a function. No layer possesses total understanding. This compartmentalization prevents coordination at a scale that would destabilize the system. Even divine knowledge is compartmentalized. Individual gods do not know everything. Councils exist because no single entity holds the entire picture. Knowledge is distributed even among the divine, reinforcing the idea that restraint is essential. When catastrophic resets occur, this structure becomes even more apparent. The individual who is warned is not warned with full explanation. They are given instructions. Build this. Preserve that. Do not ask why. The warning is not informational, it is procedural. Procedural knowledge survives disruption. Explanatory knowledge does not. This distinction explains why so many ancient texts feel incomplete to modern readers. We want context, we want reasoning, we want causes spelled out, but the tablets often move directly from observation to action. The world has changed. Do this next. The why is assumed or omitted. What matters is that the next cycle can begin. Knowledge that was preserved is almost always knowledge that can be applied without interpretation. How to plant, how to build, how to measure time, how to perform rituals that re-establish communication between gods and humans. These are instructions, not theories. Abstract understanding would not survive a reset. Practices can. This also explains why so much knowledge is encoded in myth, rather than stated directly. Myths are resilient. They can be remembered even when literacy is lost. They can adapt to new contexts. Their surface meaning can shift while their structural function remains intact. A myth about a flood does not need to be scientifically accurate to transmit essential information. It teaches that water can overwhelm, that survival requires preparation, that continuity depends on preserving seeds and animals, that rebuilding follows disruption. These lessons remain useful regardless of interpretation. By contrast, explicit explanations of cycles and thresholds would likely be lost or misused. Another important aspect is timing. Knowledge that is shared too early changes outcomes. Knowledge that is shared too late becomes irrelevant. Preservation allows knowledge to be accessed when conditions align, without forcing change prematurely. This is why certain texts appear to resurface after long periods of silence. Knowledge is not always active. It is dormant, waiting for a context where it can be applied. Dormancy is a form of preservation. The underworld plays a symbolic role here as well. It is not only a place for the dead, it is a storage space. Things placed there are not destroyed. They are removed from circulation. Knowledge, like souls, can be held back until conditions allow its return. The Anunnaki, as administrators of timing, oversee this process indirectly. They do not decide what knowledge is true. They oversee when it becomes operative. Knowledge preserved but not shared does not destabilize the present. It prepares the future. This logic also explains why humanity is rarely warned collectively. Collective warning would be a form of shared knowledge. Shared knowledge would enable coordinated action. Coordinated action could prevent or distort the reset, preserving complexity that the reset is meant to reduce. Preservation avoids this problem. It allows continuity without interference. The silence surrounding certain knowledge is not ignorance, it is restraint. This restraint extends to the recording of events themselves. The tablets do not document everything that happens. They select, they compress, they leave gaps. This selectivity is not due solely to loss or decay. It reflects an editorial choice. Only what is necessary for future function is recorded. This is why king lists matter more than narratives. Names and sequences can re-establish legitimacy. Detailed histories cannot. After a reset, authority must be reconstructed quickly. Knowing who ruled and in what order provides a scaffold. Knowing why they ruled is secondary. The same applies to calendars. Timekeeping survives because it structures agriculture, ritual, and administration. Without calendars, order cannot be rebuilt. Astronomical knowledge persists because it anchors cycles. Philosophical reflection does not. This selective preservation reveals a world view that prioritizes recovery over reflection. Even moral knowledge is treated cautiously. The tablets do not emphasize ethical lessons in the way later traditions do. They do not urge humanity to change behavior to avoid future destruction. Instead, they describe consequences and adjustments. The implication is that behavior will repeat regardless of instruction. Human nature is not expected to change fundamentally. Systems must account for that. This assumption reinforces the choice to preserve rather than share. Sharing implies belief in correction through awareness. Preservation assumes repetition and prepares accordingly. The contrast between preserved and shared knowledge also helps explain later misunderstandings. When fragments of ancient knowledge resurface without their original context, they are often interpreted as warnings or prophecies, but they were not designed to function that way. They were designed to endure, not to persuade. Endurance requires minimalism. A detailed warning would be obsolete after one cycle. A pattern survives indefinitely. This is why so many ancient texts feel frustratingly vague. They are not incomplete. They are efficient. They carry just enough information to restart processes after disruption. The question of who controls preserved knowledge is also important. It is rarely the masses. It is specialists, priests, scribes, kings. These roles exist precisely to safeguard continuity. Their authority depends on access to preserved knowledge, not on sharing it. This creates inequality, but inequality is not framed as injustice. It is framed as necessity. Order requires hierarchy. Hierarchy requires a symmetry of knowledge. The tablets do not apologize for this. They assume it. This assumption becomes especially clear after resets. When humanity re-emerges, knowledge does not return all at once. It reappears gradually. Agriculture resumes. Writing is redeveloped. Institutions reform. The pace is slow. This prevents immediate overexpansion. Preserved knowledge re-enters the world carefully. This slow reintroduction is itself a form of timing. Knowledge is not released until conditions can sustain it. This prevents the next cycle from accelerating too quickly toward instability. The idea that knowledge is preserved, not shared, also reframes modern expectations. We often assume that ancient peoples were trying to warn the future, that they encoded messages meant to be deciphered later. But the tablets do not support this interpretation. They were not addressing distant generations. They were stabilizing near futures. Their concern was not what humanity might become thousands of years later. It was whether order could be restored after the next disruption. Preserved knowledge serves that purpose. Shared knowledge does not. This is why so much ancient wisdom feels practical rather than revelatory. It tells you how to do something, not why it matters. It assumes the why will become clear when needed. As we continue forward, this distinction will matter more and more. If the Anunnaki and other gods operated within a system that prioritized preservation over dissemination, then silence is not absence. It is function. What is not said is often more important than what is. Knowledge that was preserved ensured that after every reset, the world could be rebuilt in a recognizable form. Fields would be planted again, temples would rise again, time would be measured again, authority would be re-established. What was not shared ensured that the reset itself could occur without resistance. This balance between preservation and withholding is one of the quiet mechanisms through which cycles continue. It is not dramatic. It is not benevolent or cruel. It is procedural. And within that procedure, knowledge survives not as a warning meant to stop what comes next, but as a seed meant to grow after it has passed. In the tablets, there is a silence that modern readers often struggle to accept. Destruction approaches. Thresholds are crossed. Decisions are made in the divine realm. And yet humanity, as a whole, is never addressed directly. There is no announcement delivered to cities, no proclamation carved for public reading. No attempt to rally populations toward collective preparation. This absence is not accidental, and it is not an oversight. It is one of the most consistent features of the ancient worldview. Humanity was never warned directly, because warning, in the way we understand it, would have worked against the very purpose of intervention. The gods in the Sumerian texts do not operate under the assumption that awareness leads to correction. They do not believe that if humans knew what was coming, they would change course in a way that restored balance. On the contrary, the structure of the text suggests the opposite. Awareness would accelerate instability, not prevent it. Human society, once it reaches a certain level of density and complexity, responds to information by intensifying its activity. Preparation becomes expansion. Coordination becomes amplification. Attempts to avoid loss lead to hoarding, competition, and further strain. In such a system, a direct warning does not calm the situation, it sharpens it. The tablets reflect a deep skepticism about collective behaviour under pressure. Humanity is not portrayed as malicious, but it is portrayed as predictable. Growth follows opportunity. Opportunity follows knowledge. When limits are approached, humans do not slow themselves voluntarily. They push harder. This predictability makes direct warning counterproductive. Instead of restoring order, a warning would trigger exactly the kinds of behaviours that necessitate a reset in the first place. Cities would grow more crowded as people seek safety. Resources would be extracted more aggressively. Authority would fracture as competing leaders claim insight or protection. Noise would increase, not decrease. The gods understand this. They are not surprised by human reactions because they have seen them before. This is why warnings in the tablets are always narrow and indirect. They are delivered to individuals, not societies, and even then, they are not explanations. They are instructions. Build this, preserve that, act now. The individual who receives the warning is not told what the event means in a cosmic sense. They are not informed of cycles or thresholds. They are not invited into the divine deliberation. They are given a task, not knowledge. This distinction is crucial. A task can be completed without altering the system. Knowledge cannot. Direct warning would turn humanity into an active participant in the reset. The tablets do not depict resets as collaborative events. They are corrective events. Humanity's role is not to manage them, but to endure them. Endurance requires ignorance as much as preparation. Another reason humanity was never warned directly is that warning implies choice. It suggests that destruction is avoidable if behaviour changes. But in the Sumerian worldview, once thresholds are crossed, avoidance is no longer possible. Intervention is not a negotiation. It is a response. By the time divine councils convene to discuss destruction, the decision space is already constrained. The system has moved too far out of balance. Minor adjustments will no longer suffice. Reduction is required. At that point, warning humanity would offer false hope. False hope is destabilizing. It leads to resistance. Resistance increases disruption. Disruption forces harsher correction. The gods are not interested in escalating cycles unnecessarily. Silence is more efficient. This efficiency is reflected in how the texts handle divine regret. Regret appears rarely, and when it does, it is expressed quietly, often through mitigation rather than reversal. One god argues for restraint, another works around a decree to preserve continuity. But no one suggests informing humanity en masse. The absence of warning is not cruelty, it is containment. The gods act to contain disruption within manageable bounds. Direct warning would allow disruption to spread horizontally across society before the vertical correction of a reset occurs. This would increase chaos and reduce the effectiveness of the intervention. The tablets show a preference for vertical intervention over horizontal reaction. Vertical intervention acts from above, decisively, and ends. Horizontal reaction spreads, multiplies, and persists. This logic also explains why warning is framed as secrecy rather than communication. The individual who is warned is often instructed not to speak openly. The warning is disguised, delivered through dreams, spoken to walls, embedded in ritual language. These methods prevent dissemination. Dissemination is the enemy of control. The gods are not attempting to educate humanity about cosmic mechanics. They are attempting to preserve the system's ability to reset cleanly. Clean resets require limited foreknowledge. Foreknowledge distributed unevenly creates hierarchy. Foreknowledge distributed broadly creates chaos. Hierarchy is essential to re-establishing order after disruption. After a reset, authority must be rebuilt quickly. Kingship must descend again. Ritual must resume. Agriculture must restart. If everyone believes they were warned equally, legitimacy fractures. Competing claims emerge. Order takes longer to restore. By limiting warning to a single line of continuity, the gods ensure that post-reset authority has a clear anchor. The survivor becomes the source. Lineage flows from them. Memory is centralized. This centralization is not about reward, it is about efficiency. The survivor is not elevated because they are superior. They are elevated because they are positioned to re-establish structure. Their survival is functional, not moral. This is why humanity as a whole is never warned. Humanity as a whole cannot serve this function. The tablets also suggest that humanity is not meant to understand resets while they are happening. Understanding comes afterward, through myth, memory, and ritual. This delayed understanding allows the reset to complete its work without interference. Interference would dilute the corrective effect. In later traditions, warning becomes central. Prophets speak, messages spread, repentance is emphasized. But these developments reflect a shift in worldview. They assume that moral awareness can alter outcomes. The Sumerian texts do not make this assumption. They assume that systems behave according to structure, not intention. Good intentions do not reduce population density. Awareness does not quiet cities. Moral reform does not reverse environmental strain. Only reduction does. This does not mean the gods are indifferent to suffering. It means suffering is not the variable they are optimizing for. Stability is. The absence of warning also preserves dignity in a strange way. Humanity is not humiliated with explanations. They are not told they have failed. They are not subjected to divine lectures. The reset occurs without accusation. Accusation would personalize the event. Personalization would invite resistance. The gods do not need humanity to agree with their decision. Agreement is irrelevant. The decision is not based on consent. This impersonal quality is often misread as coldness. But within an administrative worldview, impersonality is what prevents cycles from becoming vengeful or erratic. Decisions are made based on conditions, not emotions. The silence directed at humanity reflects this impersonality. Another factor is memory. If humanity were warned directly, the warning itself would become the dominant memory. The focus would shift from understanding patterns to recalling fear. Future generations would inherit panic rather than structure. By contrast, when no direct warning is given, memory forms around outcomes rather than anticipation. The flood is remembered, not the warning. The reset becomes a lesson about limits, not a trauma about ignored advice. This distinction shapes cultural continuity. Memory anchored in outcomes is stable. Memory anchored in fear decays into myth and superstition. The tablets preserve patterns, not panic. There is also an implicit trust in the system itself. The gods do not feel the need to explain themselves because explanation would not change the necessity of action. The world will correct itself through intervention regardless of understanding. Human comprehension is not required for cosmic function. This is perhaps the most unsettling implication. Humanity is not central to decision-making. Humans are participants, not partners. Their ignorance is not a flaw. It is a boundary. Boundaries preserve order. This logic extends even to the gods themselves. Not all gods know everything. Decisions are compartmentalized. Information is restricted. Silence exists even within the divine realm. This reinforces the idea that restraint in knowledge is a universal principle. If the gods limit their own awareness, humanity cannot expect transparency. The absence of direct warning also explains why so many later cultures interpret ancient texts as incomplete or enigmatic. They expect revelation. They find silence, but the silence is intentional. It signals that the event was not meant to be prevented. When knowledge surfaces later, it does so as story, not instruction. The flood is told as myth. The reset becomes narrative. This allows reflection without interference. By the time humanity understands what happened, the cycle has already turned. This delayed understanding is safer. As we move forward, this becomes increasingly important. If humanity was never warned directly, then foreknowledge did not function as a gift meant to save everyone. It functioned as a tool to preserve continuity through select lines. The Anunnaki and other figures did not withhold warning out of secrecy or cruelty. They withheld it because warning would have altered behavior in ways that destabilized the system further. Silence was not absence of care. It was part of care. Care for order, not for comfort. Within a world governed by cycles rather than endings, warning humanity directly would suggest that an ending could be avoided. The tablets do not support this belief. They support a different one. That once balance is lost beyond repair, correction must occur quietly, decisively, and without negotiation. Humanity was never warned directly because humanity was never meant to stop the reset. Humanity was meant to continue after it. And that continuation depended not on foreknowledge, but on the careful preservation of just enough to begin again. Before every reset described in the tablets, there is a pause that is easy to overlook. Not an event, not a declaration, not a visible sign in the sky or on the land, but a withdrawal, a thinning of activity, a quieting that spreads unevenly, touching records first, then institutions, then memory itself. This silence is not absence. It is function. The Sumerian texts do not describe resets as sudden ruptures emerging from normal life without warning. They describe a gradual fading of articulation, fewer inscriptions, shorter records, gaps in king lists, ritual language that becomes repetitive rather than expansive. These are not signs of ignorance or decline in capability. They are indicators that the system is approaching a threshold where further articulation would no longer serve order. Silence appears when explanation loses its usefulness. In a system governed by cycles, information does not always stabilize conditions. At certain stages, information accelerates instability. Discussion multiplies interpretations. Interpretations multiply actions. Actions multiply strain. When this happens, the most stabilizing response is not clarification, but restraint. The tablets reflect this understanding with remarkable consistency. before floods, before major withdrawals of divine presence, before population reductions, the narrative density thins. Stories do not build toward a climax, they trail off. They repeat familiar formulas, they stop naming details. This is not narrative weakness, it is narrative alignment with function. Silence allows processes already in motion to complete without interference. Once a system has crossed a point where correction is inevitable, further articulation becomes noise. Noise is precisely what the gods identify as destabilizing. To speak more at that stage would be to worsen the condition that demands correction. Silence is therefore not passivity, it is containment. One of the clearest indications of this can be seen in the way divine communication changes before major resets. Earlier periods are marked by frequent interaction. Gods speak openly. Instructions are detailed. Rituals are explained. Over time, this communication narrows. Messages become symbolic. Dreams replace speech. Omens replace explanation. Eventually, even these thin out. The gods do not become distant because they have lost interest. They become distant because presence itself has become destabilizing. Direct interaction encourages growth. Growth increases density. Density increases noise. Silence interrupts this feedback loop. This logic also applies to human institutions. Before resets, central authority weakens without being formally overthrown. Kings are listed with shorter reigns. Titles repeat without elaboration. Administrative language becomes formulaic. These are signs that authority is no longer expanding. It is coasting. Coasting is a precursor to reduction. Silence creates a buffer. It slows acceleration without reversing it. It allows pressure to equalize enough that when intervention occurs, it does not shatter the entire structure. This is why the tablets do not depict the gods issuing final warnings or last instructions to humanity. Such acts would be loud. They would provoke reaction. Reaction would create chaos. Chaos would force harsher correction. Silence keeps correction proportionate. There is also a deeper reason silence appears before resets. Silence marks the point where human agency ceases to matter. Up until that point, choices still influence outcomes. After that point, outcomes are locked in. Speaking would imply negotiation. Silence signals finality without confrontation. This is especially clear in flood narratives. Once the warning has been delivered to the chosen individual, the gods fall silent. There is no further communication, no reassurance, no commentary. The waters rise without explanation. Explanation is no longer relevant. The same pattern appears in king lists. After long sequences of exaggerated rains, there is a break. The text does not explain why. It does not justify the interruption. It simply moves on. Kingship continues, but under new conditions. Silence bridges the two states. This bridging function is crucial. Silence allows the old order to end without argument. It allows the new order to begin without having to justify itself in relation to the old. Memory is preserved, but commentary is withheld. Commentary would invite comparison. Comparison would invite resistance. Silence prevents that. The role of silence also explains why later cultures often misinterpret ancient gaps as loss or ignorance. From a modern standpoint, absence of record implies failure. But from within the Sumerian worldview, absence is strategic. Not everything needs to be said. Not everything benefits from being recorded. Recording fixes things in place. Fixation resists change. Resets require flexibility. Silence preserves flexibility by allowing meaning to drift. Stories simplify. Details erode. What remains is structure, not precision. This structure is adaptable. It can be reinterpreted under new conditions without contradiction. Precision would anchor memory too firmly to the past. The Sumerians did not want the future to rebuild the past exactly as it was. They wanted it to rebuild order. Order does not require detailed explanation. It requires functional patterns. Silence also shapes how trauma is processed. The tablets do not dwell on suffering. They do not catalogue losses. They do not memorialize destruction in emotional terms. This is not denial. It is prioritization. Dwelling on loss anchors identity in what no longer exists. Silence allows identity to shift toward what remains. This is essential for recovery. By not speaking extensively about destruction, the culture avoids being defined by it. The flood becomes a boundary, not a wound. Silence ensures that the memory of loss does not overwhelm the process of rebuilding. This restraint is often mistaken for coldness. But within a cyclical worldview, restraint is what prevents cycles from becoming cumulative trauma. Each reset clears the slate partially. Silence ensures that emotional residue does not accumulate across cycles. The gods model this restraint. They do not argue endlessly. They do not justify themselves to humanity. They act, then withdraw. Their withdrawal is not abandonment. It is space. Space is necessary for reorganization. Silence also allows for selective survival of meaning. When records thin, only the most essential elements persist. Names, roles, ritual forms. These are easier to carry through disruption than complex explanations. Silence filters knowledge. This filtering aligns with the preservation strategy discussed earlier. Knowledge that must survive is embedded in practice, not discourse. Silence ensures that practice continues without being overwhelmed by interpretation. Interpretation multiplies options. Options increase instability. Silence narrows focus. There is also a temporal aspect to silence. Silence slows perception. Without constant narration, time feels heavier. Events feel larger. This weight prepares societies psychologically for disruption. A world full of constant explanation feels controllable. A world growing quiet feels uncertain. Uncertainty dampens expansion. The approach of silence therefore serves as an early-stage correction, even before physical intervention occurs. It is a soft boundary placed around a system nearing its limits. Only when silence is no longer sufficient does destruction follow. This sequence matters. Silence first, intervention second, rebuilding third. Skipping silence would force more violent correction. The tablets preserve this sequence consistently. Silence is not a failure to communicate. It is communication through absence. For the Anunnaki and other administrative figures, silence is part of their function. As administrators of timing, they recognize when speech would distort timing rather than clarify it. Their authority lies in restraint. Power announces itself. Timing waits. Silence also preserves dignity. By not warning humanity directly, by not announcing destruction publicly, the gods avoid humiliating the population. There is no spectacle of judgment, no public condemnation. The reset occurs without theatrical blame. This allows humanity to continue without carrying the burden of explicit rejection. The world changes, but humanity is not told it has been rejected. This distinction supports continuity. Later traditions that emphasize proclamation and prophecy reflect a different relationship between knowledge and agency. They assume that awareness can change outcomes. The Sumerian texts do not share this assumption. They assume that once silence descends, outcomes are already set. Silence is the sign that deliberation has ended. It is also the sign that responsibility has shifted. Before silence, adjustment might still occur through behavior. After silence, responsibility lies with the system itself. Humans are no longer actors. They are passengers. This framing removes moral panic from destruction. There is no frantic attempt to interpret signs, no rush to appease. The gods do not demand last-minute obedience. Silence prevents chaos. As we move forward, this role of silence becomes increasingly important for understanding how resets were managed without open conflict. The absence of warning, the withholding of explanation, the narrowing of narrative detail, all work together to ensure that intervention remains proportionate. The reset does not erupt into a world already destabilized by fear and speculation. It enters a world that has already grown quiet. That quiet is not peace, it is readiness. Readiness for reduction, readiness for simplification, readiness for transition. Silence before every reset is therefore not a void. It is a mechanism, a deliberate thinning of activity that allows the system to reach a state where correction can occur without tearing everything apart. In the tablets, silence is the last sign before the world changes shape. Not because the gods have nothing left to say, but because saying anything more would only make what comes next harder to survive. And in a world governed by cycles rather than endings, survival depends as much on what is withheld as on what is preserved. When the world changes in the tablets, the gods do not remain untouched. They do not stand outside the transformation as distant observers watching creation rearrange itself beneath them. Change moves through the entire structure of existence, and that includes the divine realm. What happens to the gods when the world changes is one of the quietest themes in the Sumerian texts, but also one of the most revealing. The gods are not static. They are not frozen embodiments of eternal perfection. They exist within the system they oversee, shaped by its conditions, constrained by its limits, and altered by its transitions. When the world shifts, their roles shift with it. This is easiest to see in how divine presence changes over time. In the earliest periods described in the tablets, the gods are close. They move among humans, they speak directly, they intervene frequently. Their presence is tangible and immediate. Temples are not symbolic spaces, they are dwellings. The boundary between divine and human is thin. As the world becomes more populated, more complex and more strained, that closeness begins to fade. The gods withdraw, not abruptly but gradually. Interaction becomes mediated through priests rather than direct encounters. Communication shifts from conversation to omen. Presence becomes ritualized rather than personal. This withdrawal is not abandonment, it is adaptation. The gods are responding to the same pressures that lead to resets in the human world. Density increases, noise grows, complexity multiplies, the cost of direct involvement rises. Maintaining order now requires distance. Distance is a form of control. When the flood occurs, this shift accelerates. After the reset, the gods are no longer described as walking among humans in the same way. Their appearances become rarer, their commands become more formal. Their interactions are filtered through established institutions. The world has changed, and so has the way divinity operates within it. This change also affects divine authority. Before major resets, authority is more diffuse. Gods argue openly. Decisions are debated extensively. Roles overlap. After resets, authority becomes more clearly stratified. Responsibilities are delineated. Certain gods recede while others become dominant. This is not coincidence. A simpler world requires simpler governance. As humanity is reduced and reordered, the divine realm mirrors that reduction. Excess divine activity is curtailed. Redundancy is eliminated. Functions are streamlined. The pantheon becomes more organized, less crowded, more hierarchical. This does not mean gods die in large numbers. It means they lose relevance. Loss of relevance is a form of transformation. Some gods fade into the background, remembered only in names or titles. Others are absorbed into broader roles. Still others are localized, tied to specific places or functions rather than universal authority. This pruning reflects the same logic applied to humanity. What is not essential for maintaining order does not remain central. The gods are subject to the same principle of sufficiency. Another important change concerns divine vulnerability. In early narratives, gods appear almost invulnerable, acting freely without visible constraint. Over time, limitations become clearer. Gods are bound by decrees. They are restricted by decisions made collectively. They cannot simply undo what has been set in motion. After a reset, these constraints harden. Divine law becomes more rigid. Decrees are more binding. Individual gods have less room to maneuver. This rigidity is not punishment, it is structure. As the world stabilizes under new conditions, flexibility decreases. The system becomes less tolerant of deviation. Both gods and humans operate within narrower margins. This reduces the risk of rapid imbalance, but increases the cost of error. The gods accept this trade-off because it preserves continuity. One of the most striking implications of this is how divine regret is handled. In earlier periods, gods express dissatisfaction more openly. They complain, they argue, they reconsider. After major world changes, regret becomes less visible. Decisions are accepted more quickly. Disagreement is muted. This suggests learning. The gods adapt their governance style based on outcomes. They do not repeat the same interventions without modification. After each reset, adjustments are made to reduce the likelihood of immediate recurrence. This learning does not make the gods wiser in a moral sense. It makes them more efficient. Efficiency replaces intimacy. The gods also become more abstract over time. Early texts describe them in vivid, almost physical terms. They eat, they sleep, they become tired. Later descriptions emphasize titles, functions, and symbols. The gods turn into offices rather than personalities. This abstraction is not theological evolution toward monotheism. It is administrative necessity. As the world grows more complex, personal involvement becomes impractical. Systems require roles, not characters. The divine realm reorganizes itself accordingly. This reorganization also affects how gods relate to one another. In early narratives, rivalries are personal, conflicts are emotional. Later, conflicts become procedural, jurisdictional, about boundaries rather than dominance. The divine assembly becomes more formal. Authority is exercised through consensus rather than confrontation. This mirrors the evolution of human governance after resets. Early kings rule through personal power. Later kings rule through institutions. The parallel is intentional. The divine world models the human world, and vice versa. When the world changes, the gods change because they must continue to function within it. The Anunnaki provide a clear example of this adaptability. Their prominence increases as the world becomes more structured. As administrators of timing and thresholds, their role becomes more necessary in a world governed by limits. Before major resets, timing is flexible. Growth is unchecked. After resets, timing becomes critical. Lifespans are shortened. Seasons are regulated. Boundaries are enforced. The Anunnaki thrive in this environment because their function aligns with the new order. Other gods recede because their functions are no longer sustainable at the same scale. This redistribution of divine relevance is rarely stated outright. It is implied through absence. Gods simply stop appearing. Their temples fall out of use. Their names survive in lists but not in stories. Silence signals obsolescence. This process can feel unsettling because it challenges later ideas about gods as eternal beings. But within the Sumerian worldview, eternity is not static. Continuity does not require sameness. It requires adaptation. The gods are continuous because they change. This understanding also reframes the idea of divine power. Power is not the ability to resist change. It is the ability to remain functional through change. Gods who cannot adapt fade. Gods who adjust persist. Persistence is the measure of divinity. The world changes, and the gods follow it, not passively, but structurally. Their withdrawal, abstraction, and reorganization are all responses to the same pressures that reshape humanity. This interconnectedness undermines the idea that gods exist on a separate plane immune to consequence. They are higher in the hierarchy, but they are still within the system. Even the most powerful gods cannot prevent the need for resets. They can only shape how those resets unfold and what follows afterward. This is why no god ever promises permanence. Such a promise would be meaningless. The world does not support permanence. The gods know this because they are bound to the same reality. Another subtle change occurs in how gods are remembered after resets. Memory becomes selective. Some gods are remembered as archetypes rather than individuals. Storm god, sun god, earth goddess. The specificity of earlier personalities fades. This simplification makes divine memory portable. It allows belief to survive migration, collapse, and cultural change. Detailed myth requires stability. Archetype survives disruption. The gods allow themselves to be simplified because survival of the system matters more than preservation of identity. Identity is flexible, order is not. This willingness to lose detail is one of the most striking aspects of divine adaptation. The gods do not cling to recognition. They allow their stories to change, their names to merge, their roles to evolve. This humility is not moral, it is functional. A god who insists on remaining unchanged would destabilize the system. When the world changes, even the gods must yield. This yielding also explains why later cultures inherit gods without understanding their original context. The gods have already adapted. They no longer require that context. They operate under new conditions. Misunderstanding is tolerated as long as function continues. Ritual matters more than belief. As long as offerings are made, calendars observed, boundaries respected, the system holds. The gods do not demand philosophical accuracy. They demand operational continuity. This pragmatism defines divine behavior after resets. It also explains why divine-human interaction becomes more distant but more stable. Fewer miracles, fewer direct encounters, more routine, less drama. Drama destabilizes, routine sustains. The gods become less visible but more reliable. This shift is often interpreted as decline or loss of faith. But within the Sumerian framework, it is maturation. The system has learned how to function with fewer interventions. The gods no longer need to appear as often because order has been reinforced structurally. This reinforcement includes limits placed on the gods themselves. They accept narrower roles. They act within clearer boundaries. This reduces internal conflict and external disruption. In this sense, resets discipline the gods as much as they discipline humanity. The system becomes tighter, less forgiving, more predictable. Predictability is the ultimate goal. As we move forward, this understanding becomes essential. If the gods themselves change when the world changes, then foreknowledge cannot be separated from adaptation. The gods do not merely anticipate resets, they are reshaped by them. Their silence, withdrawal, and reorganization are not signs of absence. They are signs of alignment with a new phase of the cycle. The gods survive resets not by resisting them, but by becoming different kinds of gods afterward. This transformation is never celebrated. It is never explained in full. It is simply shown through shifts in presence, authority, and memory. The world changes. The gods change with it. And because they do, continuity remains possible. The system holds, not because nothing is lost, but because loss is accepted as part of how existence sustains itself over time. And in that acceptance, both gods and humans continue, altered, constrained, and carried forward into whatever form the next cycle requires. Not all knowledge in the tablets was meant to remain active. Much of it was never intended to guide daily life, shape policy, or influence decisions in the present. Instead, certain forms of knowledge were preserved with a different purpose entirely. They were designed to persist beyond collapse, beyond abandonment, beyond the disappearance of the very societies that created them. This was not accidental, and it was not sentimental. It was strategic. The Sumerians did not assume that civilizations were permanent. Cities rose, flourished, and vanished within spans that were short when measured against the cycles described in their texts. Writing itself was young and fragile. Archives burned, temples fell into ruin, languages shifted. The people who recorded these ideas understood that most of what they built would not survive indefinitely. That understanding shaped what they chose to preserve. Knowledge meant to outlast civilizations had to be different from knowledge meant to run them. Administrative records, trade accounts, legal disputes, and everyday correspondence were essential for managing a living city, but they were not designed to survive disruption. They were practical, immediate, and disposable. When cities fell, these records lost their function. No effort was made to encode them for the distant future. By contrast, certain kinds of knowledge were treated differently. They were copied repeatedly, embedded in ritual, encoded in myth, or inscribed in durable materials. These were not instructions for maintaining the present. They were frameworks for restarting the future. This distinction explains why some of the oldest texts feel strangely detached from lived reality. They do not tell you how to respond to a specific crisis. They do not advise on reform. They do not propose solutions. Instead, they describe patterns, origins, sequences, relationships between forces. These are not manuals. They are scaffolds. A scaffold does not tell you what to build. It allows building to happen again. The Sumerians understood that after a reset, context would be lost. People would not remember why certain institutions existed. They would not recall the original causes of disruption. They might not even understand the language of the past. Knowledge meant to outlast civilizations had to survive without its original context. This requirement shaped its form. It could not depend on precise terminology. It could not require specialized education to interpret. It could not assume continuity of culture. It had to be flexible enough to be reinterpreted under new conditions while still preserving its core structure. Myth excels at this. Myth does not preserve details. It preserves relationships. Water overwhelms land. Order emerges from chaos. Excess leads to correction. Survival requires preservation of essentials. These ideas remain intelligible even when everything else changes. A technical manual becomes useless when its tools no longer exist. A myth remains usable as long as humans still experience fear, loss, rebuilding, and continuity. This is why creation stories, flood narratives, and genealogies were preserved with such care. They were not historical records in the modern sense. They were continuity devices. Genealogies in particular serve a crucial function across resets. They re-establish legitimacy. They create a sense of sequence. Even when names are forgotten or altered, the idea that authority descends rather than emerges spontaneously stabilizes new societies. After a collapse, people do not ask for explanations. They ask who should lead. Genealogy answers that question quickly. Calendrical knowledge serves a similar purpose. Knowing how to measure time allows agriculture to resume, ritual to restart, coordination to occur. Calendars survive not because they are accurate forever, but because they provide rhythm. Rhythm restores order. The same applies to basic cosmological frameworks: heaven above, earth below, underworld beneath. These structures do not explain everything, but they orient human experience. They give people a way to place themselves within a larger system, even when that system is only partially understood. Orientation is more important than explanation after disruption. Knowledge meant to outlast civilizations therefore avoids specificity. It avoids prediction. It avoids prescription. It does not say when the next reset will occur. It does not say how to prevent it. It says that such events are part of the structure of existence. This knowledge does not empower, it steadies. The Sumerians did not preserve knowledge to make future societies stronger. They preserved it to make them functional. Strength invites expansion. Expansion invites imbalance. Function allows survival within limits. This is why so much preserved knowledge feels incomplete to modern readers. We expect ancient wisdom to tell us what to do. Instead, it tells us what tends to happen. The responsibility for action remains with each generation. but within boundaries that have already been established. Another important feature of this preserved knowledge is that it is rarely explicit about agency. The texts do not emphasize who caused what in moral terms, they emphasize what followed what. Noise leads to disturbance. Disturbance leads to intervention. Intervention leads to reduction. Reduction leads to stability. Agency is secondary to sequence. This sequencing survives cultural change because it does not depend on belief in specific gods. A later culture can replace names, reinterpret figures, or moralize events, and the underlying sequence still holds. This adaptability is intentional. Knowledge meant to outlast civilizations cannot be rigid. Rigidity breaks under new conditions. Flexibility allows survival. The underworld once again plays a symbolic role here. It is the place where things are not destroyed, but withheld. Knowledge placed in the underworld is knowledge that is not meant to influence the present. It is meant to persist quietly until it is needed again. This is why certain texts seem to surface only after periods of disruption. Knowledge becomes visible when context aligns. Dormancy is a form of preservation. The Anunnaki, as administrators of timing, are closely linked to this process. They do not disseminate knowledge. They regulate its availability. What is preserved remains inactive until conditions require it. This prevents knowledge from accelerating cycles prematurely. Knowledge released too early destabilizes. Knowledge released too late is irrelevant. Preservation allows timing to be adjusted. This approach also explains why some knowledge appears fragmented or symbolic rather than complete. Fragments can be reassembled differently by different cultures. Symbols can carry meaning across languages. Completeness would limit reinterpretation. The Sumerians did not expect future civilizations to look like them. They expected difference. What they preserved had to survive difference. This expectation is visible in the way myths tolerate contradiction. Multiple versions of the same story coexist. Details change. Outcomes remain consistent. This tolerance is not confusion. It is robustness. A single authoritative version would be brittle. Multiple versions increase survivability. The same logic applies to ritual. Ritual actions are preserved even when their original explanations are forgotten. People continue to perform them because they work, not because they understand why. This is not ignorance. It is efficiency. Function precedes meaning. Knowledge that outlasts civilizations often survives as habit rather than theory. Farming techniques persist through imitation. Architectural principles endure through repetition. Social roles continue because they fit human behavior. These forms of knowledge do not require literacy. They require memory. Memory survives collapse better than archives. This is why writing, paradoxically, is not the primary carrier of the most durable knowledge. Writing preserves details. Details are fragile. Memory preserves patterns. Patterns are resilient. The tablets themselves acknowledge this indirectly. They frequently reference older traditions that were never written down. Oral transmission is treated as legitimate, even sacred. Writing supplements memory. It does not replace it. Knowledge meant to outlast civilizations therefore exists at the intersection of memory and inscription. Enough is written to anchor it. Enough is left unwritten to allow adaptation. This balance prevents stagnation. Another reason some knowledge was meant to outlast civilizations is that resets do not affect all regions equally. While one area collapses, another may persist. Knowledge that survives must be transferable across space as well as time. Local specificity would prevent this. Universal structure enables it. Flood narratives, for example, can be localized or universalized depending on context. The core idea remains intact. Water overwhelms order. Survivors rebuild. Limits change. This adaptability allows the same knowledge to remain relevant across different environmental and cultural conditions. The Sumerians understood that future societies might not live between the same rivers, worship the same gods, or speak the same language, but they would still experience growth, strain, disruption, and rebuilding. That is what the preserved knowledge addresses. It is also important to note what was not preserved. There is no attempt to preserve precise technological instructions for advanced systems. There is no detailed description of infrastructure that could be replicated exactly. This suggests that technological continuity was not a priority. Technology evolves quickly. Preserving it risks obsolescence. Structural knowledge evolves slowly. Preserving it pays dividends. This challenges modern assumptions about ancient wisdom. We often imagine that the most valuable knowledge is technical or predictive. The Sumerians appear to have believed the opposite. The most valuable knowledge was structural and cyclical. Knowing that resets occur is more durable than knowing when one will occur. Knowing that excess leads to correction is more useful than knowing the exact mechanism. Knowing how to restart order is more important than knowing how to avoid loss entirely. This perspective also explains why preserved knowledge is often emotionally restrained. It does not dramatize suffering. It does not glorify survival. It does not promise redemption. Emotional intensity would anchor interpretation too tightly to a specific event. Restraint allows reuse. Knowledge that outlasts civilizations must not depend on the emotional state of its creators. It must be usable by people who do not share their trauma or triumph. This emotional neutrality is often mistaken for detachment. In reality, it is generosity. It allows future generations to apply the knowledge without inheriting the emotional burden of the past. The Sumerians were not trying to speak to us directly. They were not trying to warn distant futures. They were ensuring that something would remain usable when their own world no longer existed. This is a profound act of foresight, but not in the prophetic sense. It is systemic foresight. An understanding that cycles will continue regardless of individual civilizations. What they preserved was not advice, it was orientation. Orientation does not tell you where to go. It tells you where you are. After a reset, that is enough. As we move forward, this understanding becomes increasingly relevant. If some knowledge was meant to outlast civilizations, then its presence in later periods is not accidental. Its survival is evidence that it performed its function. The question is not why ancient knowledge survived. The question is why this knowledge, and not other forms, endured. The answer lies in what it was designed to do. It was never meant to save a civilization. It was meant to survive one. In the tablets, the underworld is rarely described with the moral intensity that later traditions would assign to it. It is not a place where wrongdoing is corrected, nor where virtue is rewarded. It is quiet, administrative, restrained. Souls arrive there not because they deserve judgment, but because their role in the surface world has ended. This difference is subtle, but it reshapes the entire meaning of what the underworld represents. The Sumerian underworld functions less like a court and more like a repository. Punishment requires evaluation. It requires moral accounting. It demands an explanation of why one individual suffers more than another. But the underworld in the tablets offers almost none of this. Those who enter it experience a uniform condition. Kings and labourers share the same fate. Priests and commoners are reduced to the same quiet existence. There is no escalation of torment, no hierarchy of reward. Uniformity is the clue. Uniformity suggests storage rather than judgment. When something is stored, it is removed from active use but not destroyed. It is preserved in a dormant state, inaccessible but intact. This is precisely how the underworld operates in the Sumerian imagination. The dead are not erased, they are withdrawn. Their stories do not continue on the surface, but they remain within the system. This framing aligns perfectly with the broader patterns seen throughout the tablets. Nothing truly disappears. Cities vanish, but their foundations remain. Gods recede, but their functions persist. Knowledge fades, but fragments survive. The underworld fits this same logic. It is where excess is removed without annihilation. In this sense, death itself is not final. It is a form of containment. Containment stabilizes systems. If every past life remained active in memory and influence, the present would be overwhelmed. Generations would pile atop one another without resolution. The underworld prevents this accumulation by holding what is no longer operative. The dead do not vanish into nothingness. They cease to participate. This is why the underworld is so closely associated with boundaries. It lies beneath the earth, separated from the living world by gates, rivers, and thresholds. These barriers are not there to torment. They regulate flow. They ensure that movement between states is controlled. Controlled movement preserves order. The guardians of the underworld are not executioners. They are gatekeepers. Their role is to maintain separation, not to inflict pain. Even the fear associated with them arises from finality of transition, not from cruelty. Once something enters storage, retrieval is difficult. This difficulty reinforces the stability of the system. If the dead could return freely, boundaries would erode, memory would flood the present, authority would fragment as past claims resurfaced. The underworld prevents this by holding what has passed. This function becomes especially important during resets. When the world changes dramatically, the accumulation of unresolved past claims would make rebuilding impossible. Old lineages would demand restoration. Previous authorities would compete with new ones. Grievances would linger. The underworld clears this space. By removing the dead from active circulation, it allows the surface world to reorganize without being anchored to what came before. The past remains present in memory, but it does not exert direct pressure. This is storage, not punishment. The Anunnaki's association with the underworld reinforces this interpretation. As administrators of timing, they preside over transitions. The movement of souls into the underworld is not a moral evaluation. It is a temporal one. A phase has ended. Storage begins. Timing determines placement. The Anunnaki do not judge character. They recognize conclusion. This also explains why appeals to the underworld are rare and limited. People do not pray to escape it. They accept it. Rituals focus on appeasing the dead, not liberating them. Offerings are made to ensure stability, not to reverse fate. Reversal would undermine containment. The underworld's bleakness is often misunderstood as evidence of pessimism. In reality, it reflects neutrality. Stored items are not celebrated, they are maintained. The dead exist in a reduced state because reduction is the point. Excess memory would destabilize the present. This reduction mirrors what happens to humanity during resets. Populations are reduced. Complexity is stripped away. What remains is sufficient to restart order. The underworld applies the same principle at the level of individual lives. Death is a reset for the person, just as catastrophe is a reset for society. Neither is moral, both are structural. This parallel suggests that the Sumerians saw individual existence as nested within larger cycles. Just as civilizations rise and fall, so do lives. Just as cities are abandoned and rebuilt, so are generations replaced. The underworld holds generations the way ruins hold cities. They remain, but they do not function. This storage function also clarifies why knowledge is sometimes associated with the underworld. Hidden texts, buried wisdom, secrets beneath the earth. These motifs are not about fear. They are about preservation through removal. What is buried is protected from use, alteration, and misuse. Burial preserves by denying access. This is why some knowledge is described as chthonic, hidden or sealed. It is not forbidden because it is dangerous in a moral sense. It is withheld because its premature use would destabilize the system. The underworld is the ultimate withholding mechanism. It ensures that what has served its time does not interfere with what is emerging. Later traditions transformed this storage model into a moral one. Judgment replaced containment. Reward and punishment replaced neutrality. This shift reflects changing social needs rather than original meaning. As societies became more focused on individual behaviour, morality moved to the centre of cosmology. But in the earliest layers, the underworld remains administrative. Administrative systems are rarely comforting. They are functional. The lack of moral differentiation in the underworld also reinforces the idea that life is not evaluated individually in cosmic terms. What matters is contribution to order during one's phase of activity. Once that phase ends, evaluation ceases. This does not mean life is meaningless. It means meaning is time-bound. Meaning exists within participation, not beyond it. The underworld, then, is not a threat designed to enforce obedience. It is a mechanism that allows time to move forward without dragging its past behind it. This explains why fear of the underworld is muted in the tablets. It is acknowledged but not dramatized. It is inevitable, not avoidable. There is no promise of escape. There is no bargaining. Acceptance replaces terror. Acceptance stabilizes culture. The idea of storage also explains why the underworld is not portrayed as active. It does not evolve. It does not progress. It is static by design. Activity belongs to the surface world. The underworld exists to absorb what is no longer active. Static spaces preserve dynamic systems. This dynamic-static relationship is essential for cyclical continuity. Without a place to put what has ended, the system would accumulate indefinitely until collapse became total. The underworld prevents total accumulation. It is the counterpart to creation. Creation brings things into circulation. The underworld removes them. Both are necessary. This symmetry reveals how deeply integrated the underworld is into the Sumerian understanding of balance. It is not an afterthought. It is a pillar. When resets occur, entire cities effectively enter the underworld. They are buried, abandoned, removed from circulation. Their people die or disperse. Their memory lingers, but their function ends. Later, new cities rise nearby, sometimes directly atop the old ones. This literal layering mirrors the metaphysical storage of the underworld. The earth itself becomes an archive. Ruins are storage. The underworld is simply the invisible version of this process. This perspective removes much of the moral anxiety that later readers bring to these texts. The Sumerians were not obsessed with post-mortem reward. They were concerned with continuity. The underworld served that concern by clearing space. Clearing space allows renewal. This is why the underworld is rarely described in detail. Details would personalize it. Personalization would invite attachment. Attachment would resist acceptance. The underworld must remain impersonal to function. This impersonality is not cruelty. It is discipline. Discipline allows systems to endure. As we move forward, this understanding will become increasingly important. If the underworld is storage rather than punishment, then its role in resets is central. It is where excess is held while the surface world reorganizes. Nothing is destroyed. Nothing is rewarded. Everything is placed where it no longer interferes. The underworld is not about justice. It is about timing. And within a world governed by cycles rather than endings, timing is what keeps existence from tearing itself apart under the weight of its own past. The underworld holds that past quietly, indefinitely, allowing the present to exist without being consumed by what has already finished its work. The tablets do not describe signs in the way modern readers expect them to. There are no clear warnings etched into stone meant to be discovered at a critical moment. No instructions pointing forward in time, no explicit messages addressed to future generations, and yet the texts repeatedly imply that something was left behind deliberately. Not to prevent what would come next, but to ensure that what followed would not begin from nothing. These signs are subtle. They do not announce themselves as signs. They appear as patterns, repetitions, absences, and survivals that feel intentional once they are viewed across long spans of time, rather than within a single narrative. The most obvious of these is placement. Cities are rebuilt on the same ground again and again, often directly atop the remains of earlier settlements. This was not always the most practical choice. Floodplains shift, resources move, yet the pattern persists. Layers accumulate. Ruins are not cleared away completely. They're compacted, sealed, and built over. This creates continuity without explanation. A city rebuilt on a ruin inherits its location, its orientation, its relationship to rivers and trade routes. It also inherits something less tangible. Memory embedded in place. Even when names change and languages shift, the land itself preserves function. This is not accidental. It suggests an understanding that location is a carrier of knowledge. Another sign left behind on purpose is repetition of structure. Temples follow similar layouts across centuries, even when dedicated to different gods. Administrative buildings repeat proportions. Ritual spaces maintain orientation toward cardinal directions. These are not aesthetic choices, they are functional templates. Templates survive disruption better than instructions. If a civilization collapses, written explanations are easily lost. But a building's shape can be copied without knowing why it works. A canal's alignment can be reused without understanding its original survey logic. These physical patterns carry operational knowledge forward silently. This silence is important. The texts do not instruct future builders to copy these forms, they simply preserve the forms themselves. Imitation becomes the mechanism of transmission. This is a sign left behind without needing interpretation. Calendrical systems are another example. Even when writing breaks down, agricultural rhythms persist. Planting follows seasons, harvests repeat, festivals align with celestial events. Over time, these practices are ritualized. People follow them because they work, not because they understand the astronomical calculations behind them. The sky becomes a sign that cannot be erased. Celestial cycles outlast any civilization. By anchoring timekeeping to the movement of stars and planets, the Sumerians ensured that certain patterns would always be recoverable. Even if calendars were lost, the sky remained. This suggests an intentional reliance on things that resets could not destroy. Another sign appears in numbers. Certain numerical patterns repeat obsessively across texts. Long reigns, large cycles, exaggerated spans of time. These numbers are often dismissed as symbolic or mythic, but their repetition hints at something else. They establish scale. They teach that time operates on levels far beyond a single lifetime or dynasty. Even if the specific values are not meant to be taken literally, their magnitude forces the reader to think in terms of deep time. This reframes expectation. A culture that thinks in deep time is less likely to assume permanence, less likely to panic at disruption. The numbers themselves become a psychological sign, training the mind to expect long cycles rather than linear progress. This expectation survives collapse. Another deliberate sign lies in what the texts refuse to explain. Key transitions are left vague, details are omitted, motivations are underdeveloped. Modern readers experience this as frustration, but from within the logic of preservation, this vagueness is functional. An explicit explanation anchors meaning too tightly to a specific context. Vagueness allows reinterpretation. By leaving gaps, the texts ensure that future societies can adapt the material to their own circumstances without rejecting it outright. A story that explains too much becomes obsolete. A story that explains just enough remains usable. Absence becomes a sign. The survival of certain myths while others disappear also suggests selection rather than chance. Flood narratives persist across cultures that had very different environments. Creation stories echo one another despite geographic separation. This persistence indicates that these stories carried something essential. They were not preserved because they were entertaining. They were preserved because they framed existence in a way that remained useful after disruption. They taught that loss is not failure, that rebuilding is expected, that order can return. This teaching itself is a sign. Another sign appears in the treatment of authority. King lists continue across resets, but they change tone. Early kings rule for impossible lengths. Later, kings reign for human spans. This shift is not explained directly. It is shown. The implication is clear without being stated. Conditions have changed. Limits have been imposed. The world operates differently now. This implicit communication is far more durable than explicit decree. A future reader does not need to believe in the literal truth of the early reigns to grasp the message. Something fundamental shifted. The message survives disbelief. The underworld, too, leaves signs. It is consistently placed beneath the earth. Things buried are not gone. They are held. This physical metaphor is reinforced by real burial practices. Objects placed in the ground are preserved. Cities buried by flood silt remain intact beneath the surface. The earth becomes an archive. This archive does not announce itself. It waits. Waiting is part of the design. The Anunnaki's role reinforces this pattern. They are associated with boundaries, thresholds, and sealed spaces. Their judgments finalize transitions. What is placed under their authority does not re-emerge easily. This difficulty ensures that signs left behind are not activated prematurely. Knowledge sealed in myth or ritual does not suddenly flood the present with destabilizing information. It surfaces slowly through interpretation when conditions allow. Another deliberate sign is continuity of basic social roles. Farmer, builder, priest, ruler. These roles persist even as their meanings change. The persistence of role structure allows societies to reorganize quickly after collapse. People know where to stand. This knowledge is not written, it is lived. Role continuity is one of the strongest signs of intentional preservation. It requires no archive. It survives through imitation and necessity. The texts also leave signs through restraint. They do not dramatize destruction. They do not dwell on trauma. This emotional restraint prevents the past from dominating the future. A civilization that remembers only catastrophe will freeze. A civilization that remembers structure can rebuild. This emotional calibration is itself a sign. It teaches how to remember. Even the survival of writing itself is a sign, though a fragile one. Writing appears, disappears, and reappears. When it returns, it does so in simplified forms. This suggests that writing was never assumed to be permanent. Oral memory fills the gaps. The coexistence of written and oral transmission ensures redundancy. If one fails, the other carries enough forward. Redundancy is intentional design. The signs left behind are therefore not messages. They are affordances. They make rebuilding possible without instruction. This is why the texts do not urge future generations to act. They assume action will happen out of necessity. What they provide is orientation, not command. Orientation is more durable. These signs also avoid centralization. No single object carries all the knowledge. No single text explains everything. Instead, meaning is distributed across landscape, ritual, myth, number, and silence. Distribution prevents total loss. If one element disappears, others compensate. This distributed design mirrors the structure of the divine assembly itself. No single god governs everything. No single authority holds all knowledge. Stability emerges from balance, not concentration. The signs left behind reflect this philosophy. They do not demand belief. They invite recognition. Recognition happens when conditions align. A society nearing imbalance may suddenly recognize patterns in ancient stories. A culture rebuilding after collapse may rediscover the usefulness of old rituals. These moments are not awakenings. They are alignments. These signs were always there. They were simply waiting. This waiting does not imply passivity. It implies patience. Patience is a form of foresight. The Sumerians did not need to know when the next reset would occur to leave something behind for it. They only needed to know that resets would occur again. What they left behind was not a warning, but a framework. A framework does not shout, it supports. As we move forward, this becomes increasingly important. If signs were left behind on purpose, then their subtlety is part of their function. They are meant to be found slowly, pieced together over time, not decoded in a moment of crisis. They are not instructions for avoidance, they are tools for continuity. And within a world governed by cycles rather than endings, continuity is not maintained by prediction or control, but by ensuring that when the world changes shape again, something recognizable remains beneath the surface, waiting to be built upon. That something is not a message, it is a pattern. And patterns, once set in motion, do not need to announce themselves to endure. As the centuries passed and civilizations rose atop the remains of earlier ones, something subtle but consistent occurred. The events themselves remained visible, but the reasons behind them faded. Floods were remembered, cities lost to water or fire were remembered. Long ages of upheaval were remembered. What gradually disappeared was the framework that once explained why these events were expected, managed, and absorbed rather than feared. Later cultures did not forget the past entirely. They remembered fragments. They inherited stories. They preserved names and motifs. But what they lost was context, and that loss was not accidental. It was a natural consequence of how resets reshape memory. Context requires continuity. It depends on institutions that persist long enough to carry explanation forward alongside event. When resets interrupt that continuity, memory survives without interpretation. Stories remain, but the logic that once anchored them dissolves. This is why later cultures remember floods as catastrophes rather than calibrations. They remember destruction as punishment rather than correction. They remember endings, but not cycles. The original Sumerian framework assumed familiarity with instability. People lived with floods, droughts, and political collapse as recurring features of existence. The idea that the world required periodic reduction was embedded in daily experience. As societies became larger, more centralized, and more insulated from environmental fluctuation, that familiarity weakened. Stability became the expectation. Once stability is assumed, disruption becomes shocking. Memory shifts accordingly. Events once understood as part of a pattern are reinterpreted as anomalies. Stories that once explained structure are transformed into warnings or moral lessons. The flood is no longer a reset. It becomes a judgment. This shift happens gradually. No single culture decides to abandon cyclical thinking. It erodes as lived experience changes. When generations pass without major collapse, memory loses its grounding. Stories persist, but they are no longer reinforced by observation. Without reinforcement, interpretation drifts. Later cultures inherit events divorced from their original environmental and administrative context. They know that a flood occurred, but they no longer understand why it was framed as necessary rather than tragic. They know that gods withdrew, but they interpret that withdrawal as abandonment rather than adaptation. Meaning fills the gap left by lost context. This is where moralization enters. When structural explanations disappear, ethical ones take their place. It becomes easier to explain destruction as punishment for wrongdoing than as the result of accumulated imbalance. Moral explanations are intuitive. Structural explanations require systems thinking that depends on long memory. Long memory is fragile. As resets accumulate, memory shortens. Another factor contributing to the loss of context is translation. Words that once carried administrative or procedural meanings are rendered into later languages with moral or emotional connotations. Terms associated with order become terms associated with righteousness. Terms associated with noise become terms associated with sin. Language reshapes memory without intent. A word that once described density now describes guilt. A phrase that once described correction now implies vengeance. Over time, these shifts solidify. Readers encounter ancient stories through layers of interpretation that have already altered their tone. The original restraint is gone. Later cultures also reorganize divine hierarchies. Gods who once functioned as administrators are elevated into absolute authorities. Figures associated with timing become figures associated with judgment. The Anunnaki, once understood as collective arbiters of transition, become shadowy rulers or fallen beings. Function becomes personality. When function is lost, stories become character-driven. Characters require motives. Motives invite moral evaluation. The system disappears behind narrative. This transformation makes the stories more compelling, but less accurate. Later cultures also experience their own crises differently. As states grow larger and more complex, collapse becomes rarer, but more devastating when it occurs. The psychological impact of such collapse is greater. Trauma replaces expectation. Memory adapts to trauma by emphasizing warning and blame. In such contexts, stories of ancient destruction are reinterpreted as cautionary tales. The past is mined for lessons about obedience and punishment. This provides a sense of control in a world that feels increasingly precarious. Control replaces acceptance. Acceptance was central to the Sumerian worldview. Loss was expected. Rebuilding was assumed. Later cultures, lacking this assumption, cling to explanations that promise prevention. Prevention becomes the focus because repetition is no longer tolerated. This intolerance reshapes memory. Events are remembered not as phases but as failures. Context that framed them as inevitable is discarded because it offers no comfort. Another reason context is lost lies in the success of rebuilding itself. After a reset, societies often recover and surpass previous levels of complexity. This success creates the illusion that the reset was overcome rather than absorbed. Survivors believe they escaped disaster rather than pass through it. This belief reframes memory. The flood becomes something narrowly avoided. The reset becomes a near miss rather than a systemic correction. Over generations, this framing hardens. The idea that the world requires periodic reduction becomes uncomfortable. It suggests limits. Limits conflict with expansionist values. Expansion thrives on the belief that growth can continue indefinitely. Stories are reshaped to support growth. Later cultures therefore preserve events in forms that do not challenge their assumptions. They remember that something terrible happened long ago, but they strip away the implication that it could happen again for the same reasons. The cycle is broken in memory, even if it continues in reality. Institutional change also plays a role. As priesthoods evolve into moral authorities rather than custodians of ritual function, their interpretation of ancient texts shifts. Instruction becomes doctrine. Narrative becomes law. Doctrine requires clarity. Cycles resist clarity. To teach obedience, stories must emphasize consequences tied to behavior. Structural inevitability does not motivate compliance. Moral causation does. This incentive reshapes tradition. Context is also lost because it is difficult to transmit. It requires teaching systems thinking across generations. It requires patience with ambiguity. It requires acceptance of loss. Events, by contrast, are easy to transmit. A flood happened. A city fell. A god withdrew. Events are memorable. Context is subtle. Subtlety erodes first. This erosion is compounded by the way memory is ritualized. Ritual preserves action, not explanation. People perform ceremonies long after forgetting why they were instituted. The ceremony remains meaningful, but its original function is obscured. Function becomes symbol. Symbol invites reinterpretation. Over time, symbols detach from their origins entirely. They acquire new meanings that align with contemporary values. The original context is not actively rejected. It simply becomes irrelevant. This process is not malicious, it is adaptive. Cultures reinterpret the past to make it usable in the present. What becomes unusable is context that undermines present assumptions. This is why later cultures remember events but lose context. They remember what can be integrated into their worldview and forget what cannot. The Sumerian understanding of resets challenged permanence. Later cultures increasingly valued permanence. The tension between these views resolved itself through selective memory. Events survived. Cycles faded. This selective survival can be seen in how later traditions handle time. Linear timelines replace cyclical ones. History acquires a beginning and an end. The space for repetition narrows. Once time is linear, context that depends on recurrence becomes unintelligible. A flood can happen once, a reset cannot. The language changes accordingly. Words associated with renewal are replaced with words associated with finality. Endings become absolute. Return becomes metaphorical rather than literal. This shift makes ancient texts appear contradictory or confused. Modern readers wonder why stories repeat. They assume corruption rather than design. The design was cyclical. Later cultures no longer inhabit that design. The loss of context is therefore not a failure of memory. It is evidence of transformation. Cultures that no longer expect cycles reinterpret the past to fit linear narratives. In doing so, they preserve what they can recognize and discard what no longer aligns. This process continues today. Modern interpretations often focus on spectacle. Destruction is emphasized. Scale is exaggerated. The subtle logic of management and timing is overlooked. What remains is awe without understanding. This does not mean the original context is unrecoverable. It means it requires effort to reconstruct. It requires stepping outside assumptions about permanence, progress, and moral causation. It requires reading silence as intention rather than absence. Later cultures did not deliberately erase context. They outgrew it. And in outgrowing it, they carried forward memories that no longer fit comfortably, reshaping them into stories of warning, judgment, or mythic catastrophe. What they lost was the understanding that these events were not meant to frighten or instruct in a moral sense. They were meant to orient. Orientation was once enough. When that orientation faded, memory remained, but without its frame. Events survived as echoes, context fell silent. And within that silence, the world continued to change, repeating patterns that were no longer recognized as such, even as their traces remained embedded in stories told long after the reasons behind them had slipped beyond recall. If the reset is not sudden, then it is not an interruption that arrives from outside the system. It is a process already underway long before it becomes visible. This is one of the most unsettling implications found beneath the surface of the tablets, because it challenges the way destruction is usually imagined. Sudden events can be reacted to. Gradual ones are lived through without being recognized for what they are. The Sumerian texts do not emphasize abrupt endings. Even when they describe dramatic moments such as floods or divine withdrawal, these moments are framed as culminations rather than beginnings. Something has been building, conditions have been shifting, pressure has been accumulating. The reset is the point where accumulation becomes irreversible. This means that the world does not change all at once. It changes unevenly. Some parts of the system strain earlier than others. Administrative complexity increases. Communication slows. Authority fragments. Ritual becomes repetitive rather than responsive. Writing narrows in scope. These are not symptoms of collapse. They are signs of saturation. A sudden reset would imply surprise. A gradual reset implies awareness, at least at the systemic level. In the tablets, the gods notice imbalance long before intervention occurs. Complaints arise, fatigue is mentioned. Noise becomes a recurring problem. These are not emergency signals, they are early indicators. The system is still functioning, but it is no longer comfortable. Discomfort precedes correction. If the reset is not sudden, then there is a long period in which the world exists in a liminal state. Order still holds, but with increasing effort. Stability is maintained through repetition rather than adaptation. Institutions continue, but they no longer innovate. The world feels dense, heavy, crowded. This density matters. Density amplifies every action. Growth produces diminishing returns. Expansion creates fragility. The more interconnected a system becomes, the less flexible it is. Small disturbances ripple outward. Minor failures cascade. The tablets do not describe this in abstract terms, but they show its effects. Cities become louder. Gods become tired. Decision-making slows. Silence spreads. If the reset was sudden, there would be a clear boundary between before and after. But a gradual reset blurs that boundary. People living through it do not experience themselves as approaching an end. They experience stagnation, frustration, repetition. Life continues, but it feels strained. This interpretation reframes many elements of the text that are otherwise puzzling. Why do the gods wait so long before acting? Why does intervention feel reluctant rather than decisive? Why are adjustments incremental rather than transformative? Because the reset is not an event. It is a phase change. Phase changes occur when a system can no longer sustain its current state. Water does not become ice instantly at a single temperature. It passes through instability. The same principle applies here. The Sumerians did not describe the world in physical terms, but they understood phase behavior intuitively. They lived with rivers that rose gradually before they overflowed. They watched fields become saturated before crops failed. They saw populations grow dense before resources strained. The reset is the overflow. If the reset is not sudden, then warning becomes even less useful. There is no single moment to warn against, no clear threshold that can be pointed to. The system crosses its limits gradually, unevenly, invisibly. By the time the reset is undeniable, it is already too late to prevent. This reinforces why the tablets emphasize silence rather than alarm. Alarm assumes a moment of choice. Gradual change removes that moment. Choice exists early, but it is diffuse. No single decision causes the reset. Many small decisions accumulate. Responsibility is distributed. This makes moral interpretation difficult. Difficult interpretations are avoided. The texts do not attempt to assign blame because blame requires a moment where something could have gone differently. In a gradual reset, that moment does not exist. There are many moments, none decisive on their own. This is why destruction is framed as necessary rather than deserved. If the reset unfolds slowly, then survival also becomes uneven. Some people adapt earlier, others cling to established forms longer. Some institutions fade quietly, others persist until they fail dramatically. This unevenness explains why memory after a reset is fragmented. Different groups experience different aspects of the transition. No single narrative captures the whole process. Later cultures inherit pieces and mistake them for the entirety. Understanding the reset as gradual also explains why certain practices continue even as their original purpose disappears. Rituals are repeated because they have always been repeated. Institutions persist because they still function, even if inefficiently. The system coasts. Coasting delays collapse, but it increases strain. Eventually coasting fails. If the reset is not sudden, then the gods' role shifts from intervention to regulation. They adjust parameters quietly, lifespans shorten, boundaries harden, interaction decreases. These are not reactions to catastrophe. They are preemptive constraints. Constraints slow accumulation. This suggests that some resets are partial rather than total. The flood may be dramatic, but it is not the only mechanism. Gradual adjustments can achieve similar effects over longer periods. Population decline, cultural simplification, withdrawal of divine presence. The tablets hint at multiple layers of reset, some visible, some subtle. A gradual reset is harder to recognize because it does not feel like an ending. It feels like exhaustion. Exhaustion is easier to endure than terror. This endurance allows the system to transition without panic. Panic destabilizes. Gradual decline does not. This may explain why the texts do not describe widespread fear before resets. Fear would imply recognition. Recognition would provoke reaction. Reaction would increase noise. Instead, the world grows quieter. If the reset is not sudden, then the distinction between before and after becomes a matter of degree rather than kind. The post-reset world is not entirely new. It is a simplified version of what came before. Simplification is the goal. Complex systems cannot be maintained indefinitely. Simplification restores resilience. Fewer connections mean fewer cascading failures. Smaller populations are easier to manage. Clearer roles reduce conflict. The tablets consistently show this outcome. After resets, the world is smaller, slower, more constrained. Lifespans shorten. Authority becomes more centralized. Divine presence becomes more distant but more predictable. These changes are not celebrated. They are accepted. Acceptance suggests familiarity. If the reset were sudden and unprecedented, acceptance would be difficult. But if it unfolds gradually, acceptance grows alongside it. This also reframes the idea of loss. Loss in a sudden catastrophe feels unjust and shocking. Loss in a gradual reset feels cumulative. It is noticed only in retrospect. People realize what has disappeared only after it is gone. This delayed recognition shapes memory. Instead of trauma, there is nostalgia. Instead of outrage, there is myth. Myth smooths transition. If the reset is not sudden, then the world does not end in a single moment. It erodes, it sheds layers, it simplifies itself. This erosion allows certain things to survive precisely because they are not dependent on peak complexity. Farming survives, basic social roles survive, storytelling survives. What disappears is excess. Excess includes not only material abundance but explanation. Elaborate cosmologies simplify, gods merge, stories compress, context is lost. This loss is part of the reset. A sudden reset would destroy indiscriminately. A gradual reset selects. Selection is evident in the tablets. Certain cities vanish, others persist, certain practices fade, others endure. There is no universal destruction. The world is pruned, not obliterated. This pruning is easier to accept when it is slow. Resistance is localized. There is no single enemy to fight. This may also explain why later cultures struggle to recognize resets as ongoing processes. They expect drama. They look for clear signs. They wait for sudden catastrophe. Meanwhile, gradual change continues unnoticed. The Sumerians did not appear to wait. They assumed change was always underway. If the reset is not sudden, then foreknowledge becomes less about prediction and more about recognition. The gods do not need to know when something will happen. They need to know when it has already begun. This aligns with their role as administrators of timing. Timing in gradual processes is about thresholds, not moments. The reset becomes inevitable once certain conditions persist long enough. Persistence matters more than intensity. A single disaster does not trigger a reset. Sustained imbalance does. This perspective dissolves the idea of a single cause. There is no moment to point to and say this is when it began. The reset is the outcome of accumulated conditions. This accumulation is difficult to narrate, which is why the tablets focus on endpoints rather than processes. The flood stands in for a long build-up. Divine withdrawal stands in for gradual distancing. Symbols replace timelines. If the reset is not sudden, then human agency during it is limited. Individuals may adapt locally, but they cannot alter the trajectory of the system as a whole. This reinforces the text's reluctance to emphasize moral reform. Reform addresses behavior. Resets address structure. Structure changes slowly. This also means that hope, in the modern sense, plays a limited role. There is no promise that things will improve if people behave differently. Improvement occurs after reduction, not before. This is a difficult idea for later cultures to accept. It conflicts with beliefs about progress and reform. It suggests that some conditions cannot be fixed from within. The Sumerians appear to have accepted this without despair. Acceptance is easier when change is gradual. People adjust expectations over time. They normalize constraints. Normalization is a survival strategy. If the reset is not sudden, then it is not experienced as apocalypse. It is experienced as transition. Transitions do not demand interpretation. They demand adaptation. This may explain why the tablets avoid apocalyptic language. Apocalypse implies revelation, exposure, sudden clarity. The Sumerian worldview does not emphasize revelation. It emphasizes endurance. Endurance is learned through repetition. If resets recur and unfold gradually, then the world is always somewhere within a reset. There is no clear boundary where one cycle ends and another begins. This blurring makes it possible to live without constant fear. Fear requires clear threat. Gradual change diffuses threat. This diffusion stabilizes society long enough for correction to occur without total collapse. As we continue forward, this understanding shifts the entire question. It is no longer about whether a reset will come. It becomes about recognizing whether one is already underway. The tablets do not offer criteria, they offer patterns. Patterns are recognized in hindsight. This does not mean recognition is useless. It shapes expectation. A culture that understands resets as gradual may respond with restraint rather than panic. Restraint preserves order. If the reset is not sudden, then the most important changes happen quietly. Institutions weaken. Memory thins. Silence spreads. Authority simplifies. Complexity recedes. By the time catastrophe appears, the world has already changed. The catastrophe is not the reset. It is the confirmation. This reframing removes some of the terror associated with destruction. It replaces it with inevitability. Not inevitability of doom, but inevitability of change. Change does not require fear to occur. The Sumerians did not fear change. They organized around it. Their texts do not shout warnings because there is nothing sudden to warn against. The world shifts continuously. Intervention marks a point of no return, not the beginning of instability. Understanding the reset as gradual also explains why the final phase is often brief. The flood passes quickly. The intervention is short. What takes time is what leads up to it. The end is swift because the system is already exhausted. This exhaustion is the true reset. Everything that follows is reorganization. And within that reorganization, life continues, altered but intact enough to begin another cycle, already moving, already changing, long before anyone names it as such. As the tablets fall quiet at the end of their long sequences, there is no declaration that everything has been said. There is no closing judgment, no final explanation. What remains is a sense of continuity that does not announce itself, but settles into place. The idea that whatever comes next is not unknown in the way we usually imagine it to be. It is not hidden behind a wall of uncertainty. It is already implied in what has happened before. If the gods knew what comes next, their knowledge did not take the form of prophecy. It did not arrive as visions of distant futures or precise outcomes waiting to unfold. It emerged from familiarity, from watching the same patterns repeat across long stretches of time, from recognizing when a system had reached a point it had reached before. In this sense, knowing what comes next does not mean knowing details. It means knowing direction. The tablets suggest that the gods were not concerned with predicting events, but with recognizing conditions. They watched growth accumulate. They observed density increase. They felt the strain of complexity long before it expressed itself as disruption. By the time intervention occurred, Nothing about it was unexpected. What follows a reset is therefore not mystery, it is reorganization. This is why there is so little emphasis on fear in the texts. Fear thrives on surprise. It feeds on the belief that something wholly new and uncontrollable is about to occur. But when change is understood as part of a recurring structure, fear loses its power. There is loss, yes. There is disruption. But there is also recognition. Recognition steadies. The gods do not panic because panic implies ignorance. They do not scramble because scrambling implies lack of preparation. Their actions are measured, restrained, sometimes reluctant, but never frantic. This composure reflects not indifference, but understanding. They have seen this before. If the gods knew what comes next, then silence becomes meaningful. Silence is not uncertainty, it is acknowledgement. Once conditions align, explanation becomes unnecessary. The system will move where it must. The absence of spectacle in the tablets reinforces this idea. Destruction is not dramatized. Rebuilding is not celebrated. Everything unfolds with an evenness that suggests acceptance rather than alarm. The world changes shape. Life continues. This acceptance is perhaps the most difficult element for modern readers to absorb. We are conditioned to expect drama at moments of transition. We look for signs. We search for warnings. We wait for something to announce itself clearly. The ancient texts offer no such announcement. They imply that the most significant changes happen quietly. They arrive without ceremony. They do not require belief or acknowledgement to take effect. They simply occur once conditions make them unavoidable. If the gods knew what comes next, then their role was never to prevent it. It was to ensure that whatever followed could still function. This is why preservation matters more than protection. Seeds are saved. Knowledge is encoded. Structures are simplified. Excess is removed. The future is not defended. It is prepared for. Preparation does not look like resistance. It looks like restraint. The gods restrain themselves. They withdraw rather than dominate. They reduce interaction rather than intensify it. They allow complexity to unwind rather than forcing it to persist. This restraint suggests confidence in the underlying system. A system that requires constant intervention is unstable. A system that can correct itself through cycles is resilient. The tablets point toward resilience rather than permanence. If the gods knew what comes next, then endings were never their concern. Endings are human obsessions. They reflect our attachment to the present and our fear of loss. The gods operate on a scale where endings dissolve into transitions. From that scale, what feels like an end is simply a change in conditions. This perspective does not eliminate suffering. It contextualizes it. Suffering occurs when systems change faster than individuals can adapt. The gods do not deny this, but they also do not allow suffering to override the necessity of correction. They prioritize the continuity of the system over the comfort of its participants. This is not cruelty. It is hierarchy of concern. Hierarchy exists everywhere in the tablets. Gods above humans. Order above survival. Continuity above stability. Each layer supports the one beneath it, but not at the expense of the whole. If the gods knew what comes next, then humanity's ignorance was not a flaw, it was protection. Knowledge of inevitability does not empower, it exhausts. Living without certainty allows life to proceed without paralysis. The gods do not burden humanity with cosmic awareness, because such awareness would distort human behaviour. It would encourage either despair or defiance. Neither serves order. Instead, humans are allowed to live within their time, responding to immediate conditions, rebuilding when necessary, adapting without needing to grasp the full scope of cycles unfolding around them. This division of awareness is not inequality. It is functional separation. The gods hold the long view. Humans live the short one. If the gods knew what comes next, they also knew that knowing too much would not change the outcome. Awareness does not reverse accumulation. Insight does not undo density. Understanding does not quiet noise. Only reduction does. This is why the tablets do not promise escape. They do not offer techniques for avoiding resets. They do not describe strategies for permanent stability. Such promises would be dishonest within a cyclical worldview. Instead, they describe what persists. Fields return, cities reappear, authority is re-established, time resumes its rhythm, life continues, constrained but viable. This persistence is the closest thing to hope the tablets offer. Hope, in this context, is not the belief that disruption can be avoided. It is the knowledge that disruption does not erase everything. Something always remains. If the gods knew what comes next, then their confidence lay not in the present arrangement, but in the system's capacity to reorganize itself. They did not cling to specific forms. They allowed those forms to dissolve when they could no longer be sustained. This flexibility is the deepest expression of power in the tablets. Power that resists change eventually breaks. Power that yields endures. The gods endure because they adapt. Their adaptation is not dramatic. It is structural. They shift roles. They withdraw presence. They harden boundaries. They refine timing. They become quieter. Quietness in these texts is not weakness. It is maturity. The most active gods appear early, when the world is unstable and forming. As order becomes established, activity decreases. Intervention becomes rare. Silence expands. This progression suggests that the goal is not constant divine involvement, but eventual self-regulation of the system. Self-regulation requires limits. Limits are imposed through resets. If the gods knew what comes next, they also knew that their role would diminish over time. As the system stabilizes, less intervention is needed. Gods recede into structure. They become principles rather than personalities. This disappearance is not loss. It is completion of function. A tool that is no longer needed is set aside. The gods are not threatened by this. They do not seek worship to sustain themselves emotionally. They require order to sustain the system that gives them meaning. Once order can be maintained with fewer interventions, they accept reduction. This acceptance mirrors what happens to humanity after resets. Humanity becomes more constrained. Lifespans shorten. Possibilities narrow. Complexity recedes. Neither gods nor humans are exempt from limitation. Limitation preserves continuity. If the gods knew what comes next, then the future was never envisioned as an open horizon of endless expansion. It was envisioned as another phase in an ongoing sequence. The tablets do not look forward with anticipation or dread. They look forward with neutrality. Neutrality allows clarity. This neutrality is what gives the final passages their quiet tone. There is no attempt to resolve the narrative, no summation. The story does not end. It simply stops being told. That stopping is not failure. It is trust. Trust that the pattern will continue without explanation. Trust that what needs to survive will survive. Trust that the system does not require constant narration to function. If the gods knew what comes next, they did not feel compelled to announce it. Announcement would suggest urgency. Urgency would suggest instability. Instead, they allowed the world to move as it always had, shaped by forces older than any single civilization. This does not mean the gods were indifferent. It means they were aligned. Alignment replaces anxiety. The idea that the gods knew what comes next is unsettling because it implies that change is not a deviation. It is expectation. It suggests that what feels uncertain to us may feel familiar from another scale. From that scale, panic is unnecessary. The tablets invite us into that perspective without forcing us to adopt it fully. They do not demand belief. They do not require acceptance. They simply present a way of understanding time that does not center human fear. This understanding can feel cold, but it can also feel grounding. A world governed by cycles is not fragile. It is resilient. Resilience does not prevent loss. It absorbs it. If the gods knew what comes next, then they also knew that whatever comes next will not be the end. It will be another arrangement, another balance, another phase. This knowledge does not comfort in the way promises do. It steadies in a quieter way. Steadiness does not eliminate uncertainty. It places it within a larger pattern. The tablets do not tell us what to expect. They tell us what tends to happen. Tendency is more reliable than prediction. As the words fade and the story settles into silence, there is no instruction left to follow. There is no conclusion to reach. There is only the sense that the world has changed before and will change again, and that within those changes something persists. That persistence is not guaranteed by foresight or control. It is sustained by adaptation. If the gods knew what comes next, then their knowledge was not a burden. It was a recognition that allowed them to act without fear, to withdraw without regret, and to allow the world to become something else without insisting that it remain what it was. That recognition does not belong only to gods. It appears quietly in the way ancient stories refuse to end. They trail off because the cycle continues, and in that continuation there is no need for final words, only the understanding that whatever comes next will arrive not as an interruption, but as part of a pattern that has been unfolding all along, carrying life forward not toward an ending, but into another phase of the same enduring movement.